Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 107 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Today, we're going to be discussing all the deals that potentially crash the market. Everyone's going to be speculating. Why is Bitcoin down? Why are stocks down? We're going to be diving deep into all of it, and we're going to be connecting the dots on this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, this week in geopolitics. If you're new to the show, welcome. We have lots of new subscribers. My name is Simon Dixon, and I've been spending about 25 years of my life dedicated to understanding and obsessing over the topic of money, investing, and 14 years in Bitcoin. Wrote the first published book to include Bitcoin and spoke at the first Bitcoin conference after investing in about 100 different Bitcoin companies. So let's jump straight in. In This Week in Bitcoin, what are we going to be covering? We're going to be covering and exploring the question of, did JP Morgan and Saylor crash Bitcoin? And what does that mean? Where do we go next? What do you do as a Bitcoin investor and long-term hodler? We're going to be answering that question. The second, This Week in Macro, in part 2, we're going to be going through the Japanese bond shock crash and the impact on the global market and what led to the stock market crash this week and correction. And then finally, in part 3, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics. And we're going to be diving deep into the implications of the Saudi and US, Trump and MBS, and the $1 trillion deal. What does the $1 trillion deal actually mean when we follow the money? And what is the impact on Israel and therefore the greater geopolitical direction that we are headed to? And let's jump straight in. So let's start this week in Bitcoin, part 1. So the subject is, did JP Morgan and Saylor crash Bitcoin? Well, if you're a long-term listener, you understand the construct of financial weapons of mass destruction. You would know that the markets are governed by a proof of weapons network. And the most important node or collective on that proof of weapons network is the financial industrial complex. That sits on top of the technical industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the consumption industrial complex, the media, and all other weapons that the proof of weapons network uses. And one of the most important nodes in the financial industrial complex is JP Morgan, one of the primary shareholders in the Federal Reserve, and also one of the important ones that is able to weaponize these financial weapons of mass destruction. So what happened this week? Well, as I said, they have been quietly and slowly building the Bitcoin industrial complex through these financial weapons of mass destruction. And you'll know that over the years, I've shared how they slowly came in, Operation Choke Point 2.0, the approval of the ETFs, then the crackdown under the Biden administration, the deregulation under the Trump administration, and then the scam of the bait and switch, where they only confiscate their Bitcoin strategic reserves and they build the stablecoin Orwellian surveillance state nightmare, all while Europe is building the central bank digital currency and everything gets vassalized. As on the geopolitical side, America is shrunk into a regional power, and we enter into this fiscal dominance stage, which I talk about in the macro scenario, where all money is used to pump the stock market and then hedge the markets and create all sorts of elaborate pump and dump schemes in order to manipulate people, reset the order. And JP Morgan was the analyst that came out and said this week that he would like to warn about strategy. And strategy, as I've always said, is a tool for the financial industrial complex. It was an implant in order to take a public company, centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, while the BlackRock ETFs and the other ETFs centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. And then they slowly lever it up and create more and more financial weapons of mass destruction so that there is debt and time attached to this equity. Then they get all the bond investors and the corporate bond investors into the market by creating debt-based products. And now you have the financial terrorists that essentially control Michael Saylor. And again, people get confused about this all the time. They get very emotional thinking I'm attacking Michael Saylor. Anybody that joins and goes public or goes through the private equity phase into the Silicon Valley phase, into the public market phase, becomes subordinate to the proof of weapons network. And what is their tool? Lever you up, make you borrow against your stock so that then they can knock you off the network, just like, in the Mac 7, they just knocked Elon Musk off the network as he started to talk more and more about the Epstein files. And so he's been knocked off the network, pushed into subordinate and control. And I said that with strategy, as they started to release more and more of the debt instruments, they slowly threw the carrot saying you're going to get into the S&P 500. That means not only do you benefit from the money printing of the Federal Reserve, which is that K-shaped economy, all the money goes into pumping up the stock market, but you also get this passive index fund where they weaponize your pension, your insurance premium, your student debt, your auto debt. They package it up into all sorts of securities. They financialize, they securitize, and then they're able to construct these products. Then what they do is they use their credit rating agencies in order to determine whether you get access to the passive investments. And so what did they do? They flexed. The S&P came in and said, strategy, you get a B- rating. Now, the promise of getting into the S&P 500 means that if you comply with the corporate bond debt holders, and if you comply with the financial industrial complex, then you get to go up. And the easiest way to knock Michael Saylor down and strategy is to crash the price and to crash the price of Bitcoin. And so you can have this submission through financial weapons of mass destruction in order to make people subordinate to the network. And the second you go public, you are subordinate to that network. As many of the Bitcoin treasury companies are now finding out, because they partnered with Cantor Fitzgerald, who's a primary dealer connected into the Federal Reserve. And he is they are a node in the network to financialize and securitize and now tokenize the pound with stable coins and various other surveillance state tools that will be integrated into other DARPA companies like XAI and everything that is currently being auctioned off in the Middle East. We'll cover more of that in the geopolitical section right now. So anyway, I said that JP Morgan came along and said, right, we'll harness the S&P. We can then say, and we can make Michael Saylor aware that, strategy could face massive outflows. And that can be excluded from basically key indices. Remember, the tools of the market today, it's nothing to do with earnings per share. It's nothing to do with revenue. It's nothing to do with sales. It's all to do with your geopolitical and strategic importance and submission to the proof of weapons network. And index funds, money printing through the Federal Reserve, and then weaponization of media are the three tools that they use in order to make you subordinate to this financial industrial complex. Okay. So essentially, by JP Morgan coming out and saying that, and I covered this in previous episodes. So if you remember, I was a creditor in Celsius, and also in previous companies that I invested in, there was always a question around whether somebody was a operating company or whether they were an investment vehicle. And in US regulations, you have the 1940 Investment Company Act, and you have the 1933 Securities Act. And securities are for the operating companies, or you construct a security as an investment company. And so once you go beyond a certain threshold, you're no longer an operating company, you're effectively a hedge fund. But obviously, if you are in the network, you can manipulate regulations in order to become, not a hedge fund, but be classified slightly differently. And so what JP Morgan was warning about is that strategy is now over 50% of its operating revenue after they made the tax changes that Michael Saylor was promoting, the FASB rules and various other things. And then he started pitching how banks can use Bitcoin as part of their collateral. Then he started pitching how everyone should lever up and borrow against their Bitcoin. Then he got more and more Bitcoin by taking on more and more debt instruments. And slowly and slowly and slowly, he becomes more and more of a pawn for the bank's agenda. But now JP Morgan flexed. Remember, it's not all coordinated. It's all about, knocking people off the network in these power struggles that happen in the proof of weapons network. But you can say, we're going to turn you into a fund. And if you're a fund, you're now the Investment Company Act. And now that is very different to that business model. And so Michael Saylor comes back and said, no, we're a traditional operating company and we hold our Bitcoin in treasury just like we hold our dollars. And so now you can use these classifications, regulations, regulatory capture at the top of the network in order to push entrepreneurs and those public company executives into submission. And then eventually you can put them in the index if they play by your game. So strategy is essentially a tool for market manipulation and Bitcoin manipulation. And this is what I've always said. If you're not in that network, which you are not, most people watching my show, even though BlackRock came after me on X yesterday and the other day, if you're not in that network, then you should not be trading. I used to work on the London Stock Exchange as a market maker. The price of stocks was essentially what Goldman Sachs said. We would then place the orders. We would go naked short. We would try and recover the stock if we wanted, or we would place those orders. And then suddenly you get an article in the Financial Times telling people why they should buy it so that we can place the order and retail become the exit liquidity for the proof of weapons network and the financial industrial complex. Anyway, JP Morgan was threatening strategy to be potentially a removal from the major benchmarks that strategy is in right now. And that creates this passive income flow that weaponizes your pension into creating, what pumps up the share price. So anyway, at the moment, strategy is in MSCI, which is puts you in inclusion in the NASDAQ 100. And this was basically JP Morgan saying, we can do a elaborate, or we can push a pump and dump here. Now, Bitcoin has at the moment been the leader for what happens in the traditional market. And we've had a correction in the traditional market as well. We'll go through a bit more about that, what that was in the macro section. But anyway, this basically means that those passive vehicles that are tied to the company's accounts, they have nearly about $9 billion in market exposure if they were knocked out of that network. And so the media was pushed out in order to perpetuate that story. And, we were in a fear environment anyway. And you can knock a load of leverage trade, those that are using the financial weapons of mass destruction to take leverage, borrow against their Bitcoin. We had Jack Mallers strike. We started getting all those push notifications, add more margin, add more margin, add more margin. You got to then chuck in more Bitcoin. If you don't have more Bitcoin, you now got to hold it in custody. If you don't, you get knocked off the network and you get wiped out of all of your Bitcoin. And then it gets pushed into the Bitcoin industrial complex. They try to get you to mine more fiat currency. And it goes back into these hedge funds and various other constructs of the financial industrial complex. And eventually, if you want, you can knock Bitcoin right down, the treasury companies completely off the network, get it to a discount to net asset value, have the hedge fund Bitcoin vigilantes short sell it, push it down, and then even you can stick it in bankruptcy. And then you can swipe in and lock in the price of Bitcoin at the bottom, just like they did in the 2021, 2022, pump and dump and crypto leverage play that they did in order to get as much Bitcoin from you. And those that are sitting back in self-custody, buying more Bitcoin every month, they say, oh, brilliant. I mined this amount of fiat currency by working my day job. I receive this amount of fiat income, and the lower the price of Bitcoin, I'm on the same side as them. I get to buy some Bitcoin each month. I don't need to worry about the games. I don't need to figure out how to play the games. I don't need to draw lines on charts. I don't need to follow the 200-day moving average, the 50-day, the RSI, all the different technical indicators, the Maya, whatever it may be, all these different things. You just chillax, play an investor, hold it in self-custody, and watch everyone else wreck themselves, sadly, because they fell for these financial weapons of mass destruction and the Michael Saylor pitch. Anyway, a decision on whether it would be delisted is expected in the new year by January the 15th. So this creates optimum time to create as much fear as possible. What happens during December? Many of the companies are judged on their returns. They were pumping their returns up by using the Bitcoin ETF. And now they have to decide, the ones that aren't on the network, if the proof of weapons network wants to knock a few hedge funds off, they can decrease their performance by pushing down the price of Bitcoin. And the ones that are shorting on the other side of that, they get the higher performance. These ones get the lower performance. And you get to consolidate more of these, do more mergers and acquisitions, and buy as many of these companies, consolidate power, as much as you need to. And now you've got the end of year performance reviews. You've got the lovely fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And then you've got the deadline by January. You can use strategy as a tool for speculation. And as I said, all of these Bitcoin treasury companies, and the main one will be. Now, I expect strategy to get through this because it's a great tool for centralizing Bitcoin. Now, your job is to just not fall for it. And that's why everyone that watches Bitcoin Hard Talk, they got out. They weren't taking on this leverage. They weren't doing these trades where they were borrowing against their Bitcoin to buy more Bitcoin and then buying it on exchange and wiping out all their Bitcoin, which then gets sucked up. Just like when my father lost all of his money in the dot-com boom and bust that got me into this 25-year journey. You can do the same, and that's what they're doing with Bitcoin. Now, remember, they can manipulate the short-term price, but 21 million Bitcoin, they can't change that. More and more people lose their Bitcoin because they don't, do this properly. And so therefore, there is a fixed supply. And just like on the exchanges, I know I'm a shareholder in many of the exchanges. Many of the whales manipulate exchanges, push Bitcoin in, and do these tricks in the cowboy era. Now they're doing it at the professional era with the biggest pools of capital in the world. You can manipulate the short-term price, but the goal is to get as much of your Bitcoin as possible. And those that are long-term investors, they don't worry about the price, and you can't manipulate it long-term. It's the fixed supply asset, the most scarce asset the world has ever seen. So MSCI is basically going to be consulting on whether to exclude these companies whose digital assets and holdings exceed approximately 50% of their total assets. And so now you can manipulate the price, knock them up above 50%, knock them below 50%, and then you can allow them, and these are the types of control structures that this deregulated environment in the financial industrial complex that the government is subordinate to are able to use. And this was basically following feedback from who? The same market participants who are now digital asset treasury firms, part of the crypto lobby, and obviously the banking lobby has all of those connections already. And so you can just push people closer to these investment funds in order to knock them off some of these indexes as well. And these are the types of things I was warning you against. I had a little bit of Jack Mallers got very upset with me because I was sharing structurally how this works. It was nothing against Jack. I shared this on a podcast recording that I did, and then someone clipped it into a video. As I said, Jack, it's nothing personal. It just means this is systemically how it works. And once you set up these public companies, you're a part of the network. And this is how, and this is how it works. And then when you're doing Bitcoin backed loans, you you may not know exactly who you work for, but once it goes up to the top of the chain, these are the deepest of the deepest state actors. Right. Now, speaking of the deep state, one of the companies that, or one of the countries that is trying to recover from the military industrial complex operations of war, death, destruction, invasion by gangsters that came from America is El Salvador. Now, El Salvador, I fear he didn't buy enough Bitcoin in order to be fully free from the International Monetary Fund. And unfortunately, if you were in Latin America, Central America, or South America, you are America's neighbors. And America is going to get more and more militant on their neighbors because they can no longer do covert operations in Asia, in the Middle East, due to the geopolitical section. And so El Salvador and Central and Southern American companies, they need to protect themselves as much as possible. Now, while El Salvador is stuck between deals done with China, the IMF, which is a proxy of the US legacy structure, and then also sovereign, building its own sovereign wealth through Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, El Salvador came in and bought 1,000 Bitcoin on top of their 1 Bitcoin a day. So these are the types of moves that countries need to make in order to build their Bitcoin strategic reserves and hold them in self-custody, publish the wallet address so that it's a tool against IMF negotiations. Now, I still believe that El Salvador, to a certain degree, is vassalized into IMF, but the more Bitcoin they can accumulate, the more they can say, hey, we are going to launch that Bitcoin bond. I went to El Salvador, met the president, and wanted to guide him on how to do the Bitcoin bond. It didn't launch because the IMF had the leverage still. And so we will continue to watch this, and we've been covering this one with interest. Now, what else happened? So obviously in Japan, we'll be covering more about it on the macro side. There has been a speculative frenzy into Metaplanet, the arbitrage between a more tax efficient structure and Bitcoin ETFs denominated in JPY, and the Proof of Weapons Network wants to denominate Bitcoin ETFs in as many currencies as possible because they're preparing for this multipolar world and using Bitcoin for their accumulation strategy in order to negotiate and leverage with other countries as we move to this multipolar world, as they shrink the dollar into a regional currency, much like the pound is right now. It only has utility within, United Kingdom. Eventually, the dollar is being shrunk and coordinated into a regional currency, which removes global hegemon status because BlackRock and the financial industrial complex are pushing that operation. Remember, they have no allegiance to country. This is a global network. The military, it's more aligned with the country. The finance, it is global. It will go wherever those weapons can be weaponized to the best. And obviously, the dollar is reaching saturation phase at the end of its debt cycle, but it's trying to dump all those bonds through stable coins and Cayman Island structures onto the American people so that Trump can push down the interest rate and you can subsidize the cheap debt below market rates so that you can't beat inflation as a bondholder, but they can dump it onto Americans as the bag holders. And so Japan, who's a vital node in the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, the Bank of Japan, has decided to be increasing their rates in order to break the carry trade. And so because the Bank of Japan is subordinate to the network, you can push up the rates in Japan, which we'll be going through more in the macro section. And there was a bit of a speculative frenzy into Metaplanet, which was like the strategy of Japan. Now, to close that cycle and to engage in the similar operation, there was an announcement that Japan tax on crypto is going to be going down from 50% to 20%. So now you've made it more efficient to go via these ETFs and various other structures, but it's also a way of closing that gap between Metaplanet and making it less attractive. So be careful of these Bitcoin treasury companies. I've always said self-custody doesn't pay a salary. Self-custody doesn't engage in these operations. It's only the short-term Bitcoin price that can be manipulated, but you can chillax, and I've shared how to protect yourself from that. But anyway, this is basically closing the Metaplanet arbitrage, which was causing a lot of its liquidity, and at the same time as closing the Japan carry trade, pushing rates higher. At the same time as the strategy and the JP Morgan weaponizing media, index funds, and Federal Reserve money printing in order to create this latest pump and dump as well. Now, interestingly, of those endowment funds, one of the important nodes on the network is the Harvard University Endowment Fund. Now, many of these endowment funds are used in the NGO network in order to do these covert operations to get foreign funding into these index funds as well. And they charge massively high student fees so that they can become essentially hedge funds and money managers to give more power to the proof of weapons network, because they're managed by those asset managers. And this pushes some of those index funds. Throughout this latest dump cycle, Harvard Endowment Fund took the opportunity to triple their holdings in the Bitcoin ETF. Now, obviously, endowments need to do it via the Bitcoin ETF because they need to be subordinate to the greater financial industrial complex, which is why these elaborate money laundering schemes happen through colleges. And then they get to implement manipulation of the curriculum in order to push research that helps their network. If you want to turn doctors into drug dealers, then you do that through the curriculum and influencing in the endowment funds. If you want to turn the world into, auto companies into debt dealers and students into debt dealers, then you teach Keynesian economics, classical economics, and pretend like it's actually how the Federal Reserve is implemented, when the Fed is just owned by the banks and is policy for banks that really, they can put the pretense of inflation and employment, but they can also push those figures and basically implement a bank first policy rather than an America first policy. So during this whole thing, I've been warning about the different Bitcoin treasury companies. One of those, Nakamoto, which was founded by David Bailey, NAKA, they had to announce that they had to sell 367 Bitcoin. And this is why these elaborate schemes and pump and dump cycles short term come there. So what was that? Those Bitcoin, 367 Bitcoin, Nakamoto only had one job, to be a good treasury company, but they don't have any revenue. So when the price goes down, they have to cover their costs to pay all the lawyers, the accountants, the salaries, the executives, the board members, that are pushed in by those investors. And so 367 Bitcoin was sold in order to bring in $35 million. Now, what is that $35 million going to be used for? Obviously, it is to pay professional fees, to do all their disclosure statements every quarter, to pay salaries, to pay directors. So remember, the lesson that I always been teaching you, Bitcoin in self-custody has no salary and no overhead and no lawyer and no professional and no operation to pay. That's why we do Bitcoin in self-custody rather than these treasury companies. We are in the phase where all of the treasury companies who bought the Bitcoin, they're basically, if they haven't managed their treasury correctly and they don't have a business that is operating, how are they going to fund that business? And 21 Inc., Jack Mallers came out and said, we're doing something different. So now it's a Bitcoin startup rather than a Bitcoin treasury. And so now the managers change it. You've got counterparty risk. And where is the startup funding coming from? Selling the Bitcoin that was pushed into the treasury, and the business pivots. And now you're in a different thing. Okay. This is systemically how it's worked. This is why Cantor Fitzgerald goes out to all these different companies and all these different people and tries to change them from Bitcoin in self-custody, OGs, cypherpunks, and turn them into financial weapons of mass destruction, like they've done with Adam Back, like they've done with all these different people, like they've done with David Bailey, like they've done with Michael Strategy. Again, nothing against any of these people. Don't take this as personal attacks. Understand the systemic nature of how this works, and they get you and entice you in a greed cycle, because now you're going to be using what Bitcoin could have been gone to their clients for their salaries, and they can enrich themselves at the same process. So basically, the Bitcoin treasury companies are now forced into a potential dump. Now that can accentuate the leverage of the deleveraging as well as the Bitcoin backed loans. So now you can get what the company that's issuing the Bitcoin backed loan can do more and more margin calls, while the company that is the treasury company has to sell their Bitcoin, and selling the Bitcoin pushes down the price. And then that's how they weaponize you as a tool. Once you construct that with stable coins, which are buying into those treasuries, mining new fiat currencies, buying the Bitcoin, using the US government debt. And so these people are becoming useful idiots for the financial industrial complex. Talking about somebody that's trying to enrich himself, Tom Lee, remember the guy that said Ethereum's going to be $12,000 by the end of this year? Correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section. I seem to remember that. Maybe I'm wrong. But Tom Lee, who created an Ethereum treasury company, is now sat on a $4 billion loss on their ETH treasury company. What can you do with that? Well, you could essentially sell ETH. So now you've got potentially a treasury company that the market forces is pushing down below one, the net asset value. And many of these companies, they can start to come below the value of the asset, the Ethereum. And what are they going to be doing? What did they announce? One possible strategy. They can sell Ethereum in order to buy back their stock. These are why they're financial weapons of mass destruction. So you sell your ETH treasury to buy back your stock, and then that can create a correction in the ETH price in order to buy back more stock. And you can essentially use this in order to unwind all of the treasury companies if you wanted. And now you've got an unwinding of these treasury companies with a discount to net asset value that's reducing the share price, that's reducing, and you can have this cascading effect as well. And guess what? His salary, his bonus will be paid because you put that construct of a financial weapon of mass destruction on top of your Bitcoin rather than just owning it as Bitcoin in self-custody. So anyway, that's what happened with this week in Bitcoin. Am I scared about the price going down? No, I've seen my $30 Bitcoin crash to $3, my $20,000 Bitcoin crash to $3, my $69,000 Bitcoin crash to $17,000, my $125,000 Bitcoin come and trade around $80,000. And all of those, the strategy was the same. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Put it in self-custody. Boycott the Federal Reserve. Don't borrow against it. Boycott the banks. And you can relax. And the lower the price goes, the more Bitcoin you get for your fiat currency. Do that for a minimum of 4 years. There is not one person in the world that followed that and has come back to me in 4 years and said, Simon, you're crazy. Look what happened. Because they beat the proof of weapons network. And that's what Bitcoin was created for. That's what the Bitcoiners of the first Bitcoin conference were discussing. The cypherpunks creating a movement of us versus the banks. We knew that the banks would eventually get in, but we also knew that Bitcoin and Satoshi designed it in a way where it is simply open source code that has the largest distributed supercomputer in the world. So no backdoors, with everyone that can back up on nodes. And when the miners or the VCs or anyone tries to centralize it, you have that user activated soft fork like we did in the Bitcoin block wars in 2017. It was designed to resist this, but Wall Street want you to give your Bitcoin to them. And that's the purpose of these operations. Call it a conspiracy theory, call it markets. There is nothing market driven about any of these moves and never has been. But it doesn't change where we go in the end. So with that in mind, I hope that this is useful for this week in Bitcoin. We're going to be now moving over to part 2. Let me grab some water. While I drink some water, do me a favor, retweet, share, put some comments below there. Help me get more and more traffic. We're up to over 110,000 subscribers now. YouTube doesn't rank me, so I rely upon you sharing, getting more likes, putting more comments, and making sure that more and more people get this content as well. Also, if you're watching the long one, we break these down into shorter videos. So if you want to share this with anyone later, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and it will give you a notification when the new, shorter videos come out where you can share just with the relevant part with the relevant people. So do me a favor, do a share, do a like, head over to Rumble, follow me over there. We do this on podcast as well. You can download Apple Podcasts, Spotify, follow me over there, and also on X if you're not already. Just going to take a bit of water and we'll come straight into part 2, what the hell happened in Japan, which will be followed by part 3, deconstructing the $1 trillion deal between Saudi Arabia and Trump and America that nobody understands the reality of it. And it will impact your Bitcoin, it will impact your macro, and it will impact the geopolitical direction of the world. Welcome back to part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 107. The deals that crashed the market. Follow the $1 trillion money. Follow the $1 trillion. Right. Now, in part 2, we're going to be discussing this week in macro. Now, the main topic I want to go through is what created the market crash. So we had a correction. And to put this in context, we're only about 3% off all-time high. However, there is forces that probably indicate that there are manipulative trends, but it doesn't change the long-term fiscal dominant strategy, as we've always covered. They are pumping Federal Reserve money. They will artificially push down rates because nobody cares about the Americans and the economy. They only care about the stock market while we make this transition. And during this transition, the proof of weapons network and the financial industrial complex are hedging strategies. They use tariffs in order to do massive M&A, bankrupt the American companies because the importer pays the tariff. That means the small business are the first to go bust. The financial industrial complex through the private equity industry acquires those companies, consolidates power into the larger financial institutions, the KKRs, the Blackstones, and various other nodes on the network. And then it also does that by controlling export flows to try and get access to choke points wherever they can in the export-dependent countries. At the same time, it pushes everyone towards China, BRICS, ASEAN, GCC, SCO, the large regional blocks that the proof of weapons network is engineering the change of order to. Now, one of the important relationships to break is the Federal Reserve Bank of Japan relationship as you're pushing out these flows. The way you do that is by weakening the dollar and strengthening the Japanese yen, increasing interest rates so that people can no longer borrow for free. And then you push Japan into needing to sell some of their dollar-denominated assets. So as you weaken the dollar, you're getting a double hit, right? You've got your US assets, you've got a strengthening currency. It takes more of your Japanese yen in order to buy some dollars so that you can buy those assets. And so eventually, rather than propping up the US stock market, you have capital outflows and you sell some of those US dollar-denominated assets, buy Japanese yen, and then repatriate that capital. At the same time, when interest rates go up, you get, rather than 0% on your JJB bonds, which are bonds lending to the Japanese government, you can actually get 2%. You can actually get 3%. And now that becomes more attractive. And so you do the reverse dollar milkshake theory that was pumping all the money into the dollar. And the dollar is propped up by the financial industrial complex. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is an engineered phenomenon. In previous episodes, I covered the petrodollar and the euro dollar, as well as the Japan carry trade. And you have these forces as well as IMF global debt and covert wars that prop up the dollar. But now you can slowly manage a transition. Because so many people are used to dollars, you've got the DXY, which is the index of dollar priced in euros and Swiss francs and Japanese yen and various other pounds and Canadian dollars. That actually started to push up a bit. And so now they want to knock it back down as we have this managed transition over time. We had essentially a correction, a crash in the bond market. And most people that are paranoid about the overvaluation of the market, that don't understand many of the things we covered in previous episodes around the AI bubbles and various other things, they don't understand that, their paranoia kicks in. And so you can trigger a sell-off and a frenzy. You can try and knock the market up by having Nvidia with their amazing earnings and various other things. And you can hedge every position through the financial industrial complex. But anyway, what is the news that came out today? I think it was today. Things are moving so fast, I forget my days. The Bank of Japan essentially came out and said that we're going to be doing a $135 billion stimulus in Japan. And that was after the correction in the market. And so that had the impact of prior to that as well. And after that, the yield on the JJB, which is the rate that you need to pay in order to lend to the Japanese government, when the price of those bonds correct, the yield goes up. You have to pay someone more money in order to lend to the government. Now, if you're holding those JJBs, those bonds, right till the end, you get all your money back. But if for any reason you need to sell them halfway through, then you're dependent upon market forces. And so as the price goes down, you need to correct it with higher yields. That's what's happening here. Now, a bunch of hedge funds use the Japanese central bank, like they use Cayman Islands in order to obfuscate their trades. They use Japan in order to borrow at 0%. Then they need to hedge out the currency risk, and then they can invest that and do arbitrage trades as well through the derivatives markets as well. And so that is the Japan carry trade. Now, by pushing up those interest rates, you get people that are exposed, or you get, changes in the dynamics of people that are able to use the Japan carry trade. So that strategically weakens the dollar, strengthens the Japanese yen, and perpetuates these capital outflows. So Japan's 20-year bond hit a yield of approximately 2.75% this week. That is the highest in recorded history. And so the Bank of Japan was used to invent quantitative easing. It was utilized after World War II in order to create these elaborate overinflated markets. And it had that, dead 10-year, the 10-year. But at the same time, Japan protected itself, unlike US, by having massive trade surpluses because it exports goods and it would invest those dollars into, and invest into accumulating a lot of assets. So Japan has a massive surplus. In fact, it holds $3.2 trillion in foreign assets. Other than Cayman Island, it is the largest purchaser of US treasuries. So $1.13 trillion is invested into US treasuries in order to lend to the government. And so basically, much of their surplus is in their capital, trade surplus. They bought everything into foreign businesses, and that can be brought back in to Japanese bonds. Now they're paying a yield. They now pay stuff that they can get 2.75% on a 20-year loan, whereas previously it would have been 0. And so after hedging costs, holding US treasuries loses money the higher the yield goes up. And so now you have selling pressure potentially, and that's what we saw. As those rates go up, you get more selling pressure on the US treasuries, and you get better opportunities for Japanese investors by repatriating that capital into Japan. That has an impact on the economy. and therefore an impact on the stock market as well, as you reverse this dollar milkshake theory and Japan carry trade. And that actually becomes mathematically necessary. The higher the rate goes down, it hits an equilibrium. But you can imagine that there's about $500 billion of exits globally that would come out, as some estimates have, over the next 18 months. Now, that doesn't mean that the US stock market will crash, because they're doing a two-tiered strategy. They're repatriating capital. They're strategically weakening the dollar so that international flows boost growth opportunities, while they redeploy your capital through your pension funds, your endowments, your insurance into foreign ETFs denominated in foreign currencies. But at the same time, they use fiscal dominance in order to wreck the American people that don't own shares, burden them with debt, devalue the debt, and at the same time, try and pump as much of domestic money into dollar-denominated assets. And they can do that through their index funds, quantitative easing, Federal Reserve policy, and weaponizing of media, which still pumps up the market. And they'll carry on with this as the proof of weapons network manages this transition. And so the yen carry trade holds about $1.2 trillion that is borrowed yen funding in order to purchase those global assets. What do they have? Stocks, Bitcoin, emerging markets as well, everything. And so you have this repatriation so that the Bitcoin trade gets less dependent upon the American trade as well. And this is very, very healthy for Bitcoin, because that will go outbound investments into other countries as well. And what's America doing? Remember what we covered last week? They're just confiscating Bitcoin. So they've now got the largest confiscation Bitcoin strategic reserve that they stole from Bitfinex shareholders, victims of the Cambodian Ponzi scheme that China's trying to give back. But America just seizes it and puts it on their balance sheet. So Trump implemented the executive order that followed the gold executive order from the confiscations in the 1930s, copied much of the language, but without making it illegal to own. But they're setting up the apparatus in case they need to do that. So in theory, if America wanted to, I'm not saying this will happen, but they could do what they did in the 1930s. They could devalue the debt through fiscal dominance and monetization. And then they could confiscate more Bitcoin if they wanted from Americans. This is why it's very important for you to self-custody, determine where you want to live, figure out the strategies, because this will happen over an extended time frame. Not saying it will happen, but America's the main country that would do this. And then you can, reprice Bitcoin, confiscate more Bitcoin, accumulate Bitcoin into $1 million Bitcoin. And then obviously the Fed will use that to financialize, securitize, or they can reset the order. So you can use Bitcoin, gold, and the Federal Reserve as a strategy for the financial industrial complex to negotiate in these upcoming currency wars against sovereign countries that have sovereign wealth funds that are aligning through these blocks in this multipolar world. And so basically, that's why I say the future of America, Europe, the collective West, is a host for currency wars and financial wars. And so that ties into my geopolitical theses that we cover in part 3, where they're manufacturing civil unrest to usher in the surveillance state, which requires all this artificial intelligence technology and the partnerships with Saudi that we'll be covering in part 3. So basically, as Japanese rates and the yen strengthen, every position needs to be unwound. That creates a forced liquidation, and they need to find an alternative source in order to pump up the stock market as well, which will keep following. Now, December the 18th is when the Bank of Japan meets. And I'd say at the moment, if you look at the betting markets, what people are saying, they're saying there's a 50% probability that they will hike rates again. And that will make the carry trade worse. So we'll see, and we'll keep following what happens throughout. But you've got till the 18th of December as the next date will be following. Now, there were some interesting manipulations of unemployment data. Why? The Fed wants to reduce rates. Trump needs a narrative to give to MAGA. He's trying to artificially push down the short-term rate so that you and your pension can subsidize the below market value bonds as we enter into this monetization, dump the debt on you. In order to justify why you would reduce rates in case there's any inflation side effect, then you manipulate the unemployment numbers. Now, we're really starting to see, and we've covered this on previous episodes, that the large multinational corporations are replacing, particularly in the tech sector, their staff with Indian H-1B visas that are building artificial intelligence. And the largest source of unemployment, other than Doge and government, was artificial intelligence in warehousing. So that's building the robotics sector, which means that the deflationary forces, the reduction in oil prices and energy prices, or artificial intelligence, can only lead to more unemployment. Now, the oil industry needs massive investment. That really goes into what we'll be covering in the geopolitical section. We're not going to get into that today in the macro side. But anyway, that's how you dampen inflation. And then you have the unemployment numbers, which means less jobs. And I don't think we reverse that trend right now. And we're starting to see that by using and weaponizing government shutdowns, which allowed, to get more money into the insurers to manage those benefits, and also more money into the military industrial complex and the artificial intelligence, so that they can start doing contracts with each other, circulate the money around so it looks like GDP is doing very well, the stock market goes up, and then Trump gets to say we got the greatest economy in the world, which he means stock market, despite the fact that America, all consumption is just the wealthy 10%. The vast majority of stocks are actually doing very badly, but there's like 5 stocks, tech stocks, which are propping up the whole index, and you just get to use these shenanigans. And so they're saying that we may not be able to release the next employment data. So there was some bad numbers, good numbers, and then they say they can change. So data just becomes impossible to follow. And these were every accusation's a confession. This is what America has historically criticized China for, because China has bad data. And now America's data is getting just as bad as well, as in particular, the employment numbers. That's a bad sign. It means that there's something that they're looking to hide there. Right. Now on the macro side, we're basically moving into the end of year window dressing phase. This is essentially where all of the different money managers that are all using BlackRock's Aladdin technology for their data feeds, they have to rebalance their portfolio, and they get knocked off the network if they have bad returns, or they get pushed up the network if they have good returns. And if they really aren't complying with the financial industrial complex, they can be pushed into bankruptcy, mergers and acquisitions, and acquired in distress. But this is where the money managers prove how compliant they have been to the proof of weapons network based upon their portfolio returns, and their ability to comply in constructing these financial weapons of mass destruction. So leading into December is where they're made or broken. That's where people get increasingly desperate. So this is where fund managers make desperate moves, or they reduce, moves that are about to lead to a loss. So crashing the price of Bitcoin leading into this phase into December, at the same time as rates, at the same time as reversing carry trade, at the same time as manipulating strategy with the January index inclusion decision, you get to manipulate as much Bitcoin out of people as well. And so expect, I think, continued weakness into December with lots of volatility as well. At the same time, remember what I said, they're taking the export-dependent countries, merging them, acquiring them, vassalizing as much as they can, because America's being shrunk into a regional power. We'll be covering more on the geopolitical section, which means that Africa and various other regions are connected to the regional sovereign, blocks that are out of territory from the covert warfare that Europe and America and the American Empire and the British Empire put them through. So you're seeing lots of little escalations. Remember the narrative? We're saving the Christians in Nigeria. I did a whole episode on that. This is basically saying to Nigeria, start focusing on a post-American world because you need to go work with China and you need to start building your sovereign wealth as well. Because we're going to be saying, we're too unreliable as America. We're threatening you, even though they know, anybody that's on top of the chain knows that those ISIS militia are paid for by Western interest, as we often cover in the geopolitical section, to destabilize regions so that the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network can financialize and securitize those assets and use it for Western interest. We're now going through reverse IMF. Now, one of the countries, Senegal, they basically just announced that they found $7 billion of debt that the IMF basically said we can't refinance. And so they just found $7 billion of debt. The IMF says we're not refinancing. And so these are the types of indicators I use to recognize that we're definitely moving to this multipolarity. And Africa is going to be partnered with the Gulf countries, BRICS, and China moving forward, which is why we're seeing, these French-speaking colonies, these Portuguese-speaking colonies, they're all moving back and back and back, while America says that we're going to wage war and we're going to save the Christians, coming after Nigeria, all knowing that it's not going to happen. And America can no longer exert influence, but the leaders basically are told through these media narratives that they need to focus on moving away from America. This is kind of, how the proof of weapons network makes sure everyone's on plan. You weaponize media, push out narratives, control capital flows at the same time as index funds going into various other constituents. So to me, these are the types of operations that indicate to me that the US is exiting from African resource extraction, destabilization, covert warfare, rape, massacre, pillage, destruction. And China's pushing the rebuild model. So this increases my belief that we're going to, over the next decade, enter into a very bullish phase for the global South and Africa as well. So I expect some kind of investments from a Gulf country, or maybe further and further into a BRICS China investment. And that means that we're moving to a rebuild strategy rather than a violent strategy as well. Now, just before we go into the geopolitical section, it's really important to start looking at many of these rare earths and other types of things. I've often said that what's happening in the Middle East, now that the forever war model is coming towards an end, cover that more in the geopolitical section, that it's not about nuclear weapons, it's about nuclear energy. And so what we're seeing with all of this AI demand for oil, natural gas, and electricity and energy is it's not a substitute with renewable energy or solar energy or wind energy or all these other types of energy and nuclear energy and geothermal energy. It's actually all energy as much as possible. And there's got to be about $27 trillion of investment. So now you don't hear anything about climate change. You don't hear anything about ESG controlling capital flows. We're just about how can we extract as much investment by pushing the AI war narrative and making sure that China and America are in that AI war narrative to make sure that the proof of weapons network gets all of that investment to prop up the stock market and facilitate it by essentially the Americans taking on the debt, and that is reallocated towards the AI bubbles, and then they push around those contracts, socialize the losses and privatize the gains, and push up those stocks at the expense of the economy and the American people. Manufacture civil unrest so that the AI can be used as part of a police state, surveillance state, and Palantir. Now, Palantir got knocked down a peg or two. their inflated price definitely got knocked down. And you've got the PayPal mafia, Elon and Peter Thiel, kind of being knocked down the network. I'm sure there'll be more vassalization because nothing stopped that train in terms of where they're going. Because the most important thing about stock price is not anything on reality, is geopolitical and strategic importance to the network, so that they can negotiate via the government these choke points and extract more into their stock price as well. But anyway, there was a lot of talk around thorium. Sorry. This could basically give Saudi an edge, but it needs partnerships in order to utilize it into its nuclear energy program as well. And so the country's nuclear program is basically fully secured, but it requires some domestic uranium, which they've been working on, resources, but they can't do it alone. They need to work with technical partners. And so this is the type of thing that leads us into, why are we getting these massive geopolitical shifts? And what the hell was this $1 trillion investment between Saudi Arabia and Trump? Is that all just manipulation in order to pump the stock market and nothing materializes? And what are the geopolitical consequences? We're going to be covering all of that in part 3. So if you enjoyed this, make sure you like, share, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell symbol, hit all. We break this down into smaller sections and artificial intelligence summaries in case you just want to watch 5 minutes or a 15-minute summary, or dig deep like me is into the whole thing. So make sure you get those notifications so that even if you miss this, you're able to do that. But you can watch this on Rumble. You can go to simondixon.com, join my newsletter. We back up everything there. And I also give you free digital copies of my book, courses on how to self-custody Bitcoin, completely free. No sponsorship, no ads, no upsell, no business model, just community building so that I can help people manage this transition into a world of Bitcoin AI, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, surveillance state, fiscal dominance, and everything we've been covering. So I'm going to take a little bit of water. Please put a comment. Please share. Go to my podcast, subscribe, follow on all the different places. Follow me on X, where I give real-time updates, and we'll be back in a second for part 3. Welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 107, part 3, this week in geopolitics. The overall episode is the deals that caused the market crash. What are they? In part 1, we covered JP Morgan and Michael Saylor and the Bitcoin side and the crypto industrial complex. In part 2, we covered macro and the Japan carry trade and various other forces. In part 3, we're going to be looking at the White House visit from Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the Grand Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as he visited the White House and announced that the US and Saudi will be doing a $1 trillion deal. Now, that has massive geopolitical consequences on the entire region, on Iran, on Israel. And how does it weaken Israel? What does that mean for the Palestinian cause? And what does that mean for everything that we're witnessing right now? So if you're new to the show, I'll give you a quick overview of my general theses. And what I'm going to be doing in this episode is I often get called a conspiracy theorist when I share things that I've deeply read upon. And I always share the books, declassified documents, but sometimes I go into Wikipedia and leaked emails from intelligence agencies. And so when I share all these things, obviously there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance where people think it's conspiracy theories. So what I'm going to be doing in this episode is utilizing a bit of artificial intelligence. If you don't believe me, maybe artificial intelligence is something you can believe. And so I'm just going to be having a bit of a conversation with AI so that we can get a bit of balance in case you just don't believe me. If you watched my, I have a blog on simondixon.com where I went through, Iran and the covert operations when the CIA and MI6 did a partnership to overthrow, install a puppet government so that British Petroleum could use it. Let me and at the same time, because of that experience, those covert regime changes in order to colonize oil, you ended up with the Iranian Revolution in '79 and various other things. But at the same time, there was Operation Gladio, which was to create strategic tension between Iran and Israel, and also force through oil and partnerships Saudi into different phases at different points. And so I've covered 9/11 in last week. I went through an overview. I went through many of these different operations. And what I want people to understand is that as geopolitics and monetary flows change, it doesn't mean you can stay in old paradigms. So, for example, Iran used to be an ally through the British Empire and the through British petroleum, but then it can become a weaponized enemy, and then it can come back to these different narratives. That was very apparent when I showed last week. You had Gilani, the ex-head of ISIS, in the White House as the head of Syria. It's because these are paid by intelligence in order to destabilize or stabilize based upon military wanting to profit from war and then finance wanting to profit from rebuild. And so you have these different operations. And so in order to understand the meeting between Trump and Mohammed bin Salman and MBS, it's important to understand the different parts of history. And I'm going to bring in some, artificial intelligence to do that.
All right, let's roll.
Okay. So ChatGPT, could you explain to my audience a little bit about how, based upon Saudi Arabia's experience with the British Empire and the operations that happened to Iran, for example, with British petroleum, how Saudi was, once they discovered oil, they were very skeptical about working with the British Empire. And so therefore they worked with the American Empire instead. And that led to a deal where effectively the American Empire leveraged their ability to extract oil into a perpetual 50-50 deal where they received 50% of all the oil returns.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to explain that. A brief history of Saudi oil and the British and American empires. So after Saudi Arabia discovered its massive oil reserves in the 1930s, it stood at a bit of a crossroads in terms of which foreign powers to partner with. Now, historically, the British Empire had a strong presence in the region, especially in places like Iran. They were deeply involved with Iranian oil through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum, BP. And let's just say the way the British handled things in Iran made other countries in the region a bit wary of falling into a similar kind of arrangement. When it came to Saudi Arabia, they were indeed skeptical about letting the British in on their oil game, given what they'd seen happen in Iran. Instead, they turned to the Americans. The US was eager to expand its influence and secure a steady oil supply, and the Saudis saw them as a counterbalance to British colonial influence. So they struck a deal, famously the 50-50 agreement. In essence, the arrangement was that the US companies, like what became Aramco, would handle the extraction and distribution of the oil, and both sides would split the profits 50-50. And this was seen as a kind of perpetual arrangement that locked in American involvement in Saudi oil for the long term. So in a nutshell, Saudi Arabia chose to partner with the American empire rather than the British, and that decision shaped the geopolitics of oil for decades to come.
Can you share how Saudi Arabia was aligned with an Arab vision that would allow, via Egypt, to be able to unify around an Arab League their oil resources, and by utilizing Israel and other destabilizing forces, this actually led to King Faisal doing an oil embargo in 1973 in order to weaponize their oil against the American empire after this 50-50 deal.
Absolutely. Let's dive into that. Saudi Arabia, the Arab League, and the 1973 oil embargo. In the mid-20th century, as Saudi Arabia settled into its newfound oil wealth, it also became more engaged with a broader Arab vision. This was a time when the idea of Arab unity was gaining traction, and the Arab League was a key part of that vision. Countries like Egypt were influential in pushing for a kind of regional solidarity, especially around shared resources like oil. Now, as you mentioned, the presence of Israel and the geopolitical tension in the Middle East played a huge role. Many Arab nations saw Israel as a destabilizing force and believed that Western support for Israel was a threat to Arab interests. So the idea emerged that the Arab world could use its oil resources as a form of leverage, or even as a political weapon if needed. This is where King Faisal comes into the picture. By the early 1970s, tensions in the Middle East were running high, especially after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Then in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Arab states led by Egypt and Syria went to war with Israel. When the US and other Western countries supported Israel, King Faisal and other Arab leaders decided to act. They imposed the 1973 oil embargo, cutting oil exports to the United States and other countries that were supporting Israel. This was a dramatic move because it weaponized oil on a global scale. It led to the 1973 oil crisis, which caused massive economic disruptions in the West and showed just how much power the oil-producing Arab nations really had. So in a sense, this was Saudi Arabia aligning with a broader Arab vision, using their oil resources not just as an economic asset, but as a strategic tool to push back against what they saw as Western interference and to assert some degree of regional control. And that's the story of how the oil embargo came about in 1973.
Interesting. So what happened to King Faisal in 1975?
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating and pretty intense period of history. The assassination of King Faisal in 1975. In 1975, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was indeed assassinated. This event took place on March 25th, 1975. The circumstances were quite shocking. King Faisal was shot by his own nephew, Prince Faisal bin Masaid, during a royal audience. Now, the motives behind the assassination have been the subject of a lot of speculation and debate. Some accounts suggest it was a personal grievance, while others have pointed to political motives or even mental instability on the part of the assassin. There's no universally agreed upon reason, but it was a deeply tragic moment for the kingdom. King Faisal had been a transformative leader for Saudi Arabia. He modernized the country in many ways and took bold stands on issues like the oil embargo we talked about. His death marked the end of an era and led to his half-brother King Khalid taking the throne. So that's the story of what happened to King Faisal in 1975. It's a significant piece of Saudi and Middle Eastern history.
Interesting. So after the assassination, is it fair to say that there was an acceleration of the Saudi-US relationship? And can you tell me what the Safari Club was?
Absolutely. Let's unpack that a bit more. The Saudi-US relationship after King Faisal. In the wake of King Faisal's assassination in 1975, the Saudi-US relationship did indeed continue to evolve, and in many ways became even closer. While the oil embargo of 1973 had shown how the Saudis could exert pressure, by the mid to late 1970s, both countries had strong incentives to maintain a strategic partnership. The US wanted stable access to oil and a counterbalance to Soviet influence in the region, while Saudi Arabia valued American security guarantees. The Safari Club? Now, about the Safari Club, this is a really interesting piece of Cold War history that often flies under the radar. The Safari Club was essentially a covert alliance formed in 1976 by several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran under the Shah, Morocco, and France, with some behind-the-scenes support from US intelligence. The idea was to create a network that could coordinate intelligence and clandestine operations, especially in Africa and other regions where they wanted to counter Soviet influence or deal with other geopolitical challenges. Essentially, it was a kind of shadowy coalition that operated outside normal diplomatic channels. For Saudi Arabia, being part of the Safari Club was another way to extend its influence and work with the US and its allies on sensitive operations during a turbulent era. It was a kind of behind-the-scenes partnership that reinforced their strategic alignment with the West. So yes, after King Faisal's time, the Saudi-US relationship didn't just endure, it found new channels like the Safari Club to continue their cooperation in a changing world.
Very coincidental, I would say. Now, I also would like to play a 5-minute whiteboard video from a blog that I created on 9/11. And 9/11 connected to the Safari Club after the assassination of King Faisal. Maybe this is too conspiratorial in order to connect the dots and make you realize that everything you've been told is a lie. I'm going to share my screen now and make sure that we can put, if you didn't watch the blog, if you didn't read my blog on 9/11 to the White House, where we go through a 4-hour documentary showing every single connection to what really happened, during 9/11. And the Israeli bombers that you probably don't necessarily, or the vans that you don't necessarily know about, but were in the FBI documents, and go through all those documents with Ryan Dawson, then hey, I'll give you a 5-minute summary right now of how this is all connected, so that then we can understand where we're going next by following the money. And so let's play the first whiteboard video, which is a summary of that blog and everything I covered in previous episodes.
You know, entrepreneur Simon Dixon has this belief that if you really want to understand what's happening in the world today, you absolutely have to understand 9/11. He recently decided to, as he put it, nail down the argument once and for all. So today, we're going to walk through his pretty provocative analysis, which he lays out in his blog called From 9/11 to the White House, and a documentary he points to as evidence. So, this is the claim right at the center of it all, pulled directly from a recent post on Simon Dixon's X account. It's a bombshell, right? And he immediately followed it up, explaining why this is so critical right now. He said, I'm posting a blog on this today because understanding 9/11 is essential to grasp today's geopolitical shifts, especially with the Syrian president visiting the White House. People are confused. So, to unpack all of this, we're going to follow the evidence presented in Simon Dixon's own analysis and the documentary he really champions, which is Ryan Dawson's Empire Unmasked Redux. Dixon holds this film up as the source of what he calls irrefutable proof, all built on declassified documents and a ton of research. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to break down Dixon's core theory. Then, we'll look at the alleged motive, a pretext for war. After that, we'll look at the method, the system he calls the privateer system, and the multinational group of players allegedly involved. And finally, we'll connect all those dots from the past right up to the present. All right, let's dive right in. To really get a handle on the claims about 9/11, we first have to understand this much bigger framework that Simon Dixon calls the proof of weapons network. So at the very heart of Dixon's theory is this concept, the proof of weapons network. He argues that it's this kind of hidden system that's designed to manufacture conflicts. And the goal, well, it's to funnel trillions of dollars to the military-industrial complex, pump up defense stocks, and ultimately strengthen the US dollar through planned global chaos. And this slide really lays out the cycle he describes. First, a terror event is manufactured to basically radicalize a population. This then justifies massive military spending, which, in turn, launders taxpayer money into major corporations, creating this artificial demand for the dollar. It's a whole cycle. Okay, so if 9/11 was a manufactured event, as this theory suggests, what was the point? Why do it? The documentary he points to argues there was already a plan in place for a whole series of wars in the Middle East. Now, what's really fascinating here is who's saying this. This isn't just some random person. This is a claim from the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, General Wesley Clark. He recalls being told at the Pentagon, literally just days after the towers fell, that the decision to invade Iraq was already made and that it was just the beginning. And according to General Clark's account, these were the nations on the list for destabilization. The source material immediately points out the huge disconnect here. Back in 2001, none of these countries had any clearer operational ties to Al-Qaeda or the 9/11 attacks. So you have to ask, why them? So if there was a plan for war, how on earth could you execute something as huge and have any kind of deniability? Well, the documentary argues that intelligence agencies have a playbook for this exact scenario, a method they've been honing for decades. They compare it to the old British system, hiring pirates or privateers to attack enemy ships. If the proxy forces get caught, the state can just disavow them. It's all about what Oliver North famously called plausible deniability. And the documentary lays out this historical context to show this isn't a new idea. It argues that using proxy forces, funded by off-the-books money, laundered through secretive banks, was pretty much standard operating procedure for the CIA and its partners way before 9/11 ever happened. So we get to the crucial question. Who exactly does the source material accuse of pulling this off? The documentary Empire Unmasked points to a three-way intelligence partnership where each group played a very specific, coordinated role. This table here really breaks down that alleged division of labor. First, you have the USA and the CIA, presented as the architects and the ones responsible for the cover-up. Next, Saudi Arabia is identified as the financiers, the ones funneling cash to the hijackers. And finally, Israel's Mossad is alleged to have provided the on-the-ground support through a network of front companies. The documentary really zooms in on this, highlighting multiple witnesses who saw these men celebrating as the first tower was burning, but before the second plane even hit. One of the men arrested apparently told police he learned of the explosion at 8 a.m., a full 46 minutes before it happened. The suggestion here is clear, foreknowledge. And the sources argue this wasn't just incompetence, it was a deliberate act. You have FBI agents on the record saying they were blocked by their CIA counterparts from warning headquarters that known terrorists were inside the US. This is presented as an intentional effort to protect the operatives and make sure the mission went off without a hitch. And this brings us right back around to Simon Dixon's original point. He says that understanding this whole model of rent-a-militia privateering is the key to making sense of current events that, on the surface, seem completely contradictory. And this slide really nails that paradox Dixon is talking about. On one side, you have Osama bin Laden, America's #1 enemy. On the other, you have figures like Abu Muhammad al-Julanani. This guy founded Al-Qaeda's Syrian branch, had a $10 million US bounty on his head. But today, he's rebranding himself as a more moderate political figure, even giving interviews to American journalists in a suit and tie. Dixon argues this is the privateer model in action. Yesterday's enemy becomes a potential asset for tomorrow's goals. This is what Dixon calls the rent-a-militia model. The asset is just being repurposed for a new mission. As the strategic goals change, the argument goes, the same players are simply given new roles and a fresh coat of paint. So, to wrap up the argument being presented by these sources, 9/11 wasn't a surprise attack from a cave in Afghanistan. It was, they claim, a sophisticated state-sponsored covert operation using a well-established playbook. And, they argue, that playbook is still very much in use today. And that really leaves us with the central question that this entire analysis poses. If an enemy can become a potential asset, what does that actually tell us about the real nature of the conflicts that have defined our world for the last 20 plus years?
Okay, so it just so happens that suddenly we move into the petrodollar, where oil is then priced in dollars before that as well. And so understanding, that there is nothing natural about dollar being world reserve currency, and it is propped up by the proof of weapons network, which is a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to perpetuate debt backed by death, violence, destruction, even if it requires your own people as well. And so that's how this network works. And so that's how the petrodollar came to be, in order to perpetuate demand for dollars by pricing it in oil. Now, what happens when that works in reverse? Well, I covered a whole video on the reversal of the petrodollar as well, for those that are interested. Now, all this to say is that, King Faisal was the one that stood up against it and did use the oil embargo. Israel is obviously a destabilizing force that helps prop up the dollar. And so when you have all of this blaming Israel on all of these covert operations, Israel's committing crimes against humanity, but they're just simply a proxy and a colony of the US with plausible deniability, so that you get to do all the criminal stuff through Israel, pretend that you're not doing it because it won't get via Congress and Constitution. And then when you no longer need the operation, you can dump it. And that's what we're seeing right now. So Netanyahu works for the military industrial complex, and Trump works for the financial industrial complex. Now we have new leadership in Saudi Arabia, which is MBS, and MBS has a new vision. What I'd like you to do before we get into the interview when Trump came to the White House is I'm just going to give you a bit more on the different factions of power, because immediately you might think, well, if there was this intelligence apparatus that happened alongside the US, now we need to follow the money and understand what it means when MBS says I'm investing $1 trillion. Because if you're working off a previous paradigm and a wrong paradigm, then you're not going to understand the geopolitical section, and then you're not going to be able to prepare for what comes next. ChatGPT, could you explain a bit about the two different factions of power within Saudi Arabia? One of them was aligned with a very, radical, literal version of Islam called Wahhabism, and that led to what became ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and various other things after the Iraq War. But also who MBS is right now, and who the other faction of power is. And is it correct to say that MBS is fighting against the Muslim Brotherhood, Wahhabi type of faction of power, and that that is MBS is fighting against that? So help my audience understand the two different faction of power within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. Let's break that down a bit. The two factions of power in Saudi Arabia. Historically, Saudi Arabia has indeed had a sort of duality when it comes to its internal power structure. On one side, you have the ruling royal family, the House of Saud, which has always been the political leadership. On the other side, you have the religious establishment, historically influenced by a very conservative interpretation of Islam, known as Wahhabism. The Wahhabi influence is a strict literalist branch of Sunni Islam that's been a foundational part of Saudi identity since the 18th century. The alliance between the House of Saud and the Wahhabi religious leaders essentially helped to unify the kingdom. In return, the religious leaders provided legitimacy to the royal family's rule. Over the decades, this conservative religious influence shaped many of the kingdom's policies and social norms. The modern shift under MBS, fast forward to today, and we have Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS. He represents a new faction of power. MBS has been pushing a series of sweeping reforms under his Vision 2030 plan, which aims to modernize and diversify the Saudi economy beyond oil. But it's not just economic. He's also been loosening some of the strict social restrictions, like allowing women to drive and opening up entertainment options that were previously unthinkable. In doing so, MBS is seen as challenging the old guard of the religious establishment. He's trying to curb the influence of the Wahhabi clerics and shift the country toward a more moderate form of Islam, or at least a form that's more compatible with his modernization goals. Fighting the other faction, as for the Muslim Brotherhood or other groups, it's a bit of a mixed bag. MBS has indeed positioned himself against the influence of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which he sees as a political threat and an ideological rival. He's taken a hard line against any form of political Islam that might challenge his vision for the kingdom's future. So in short, yes, MBS is essentially trying to reform Saudi Arabia by reducing the influence of the ultra-conservative Wahhabi faction and other Islamist groups and moving the kingdom toward a different kind of future, one that's a bit more open and aligned with his economic and social reforms. That helps clarify the two factions of power within Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Okay, so the point here is that when you understand the proof of weapons network and you know that they weaponize media, you know that whatever you're hearing in the media is from the perspective of what those that control the media want you to understand. And there are different factions of power. I've covered this in the past. So you have something like Axios, which is Israel-aligned power. Israel-aligned power is connected to the military-industrial complex. Then you have things like the Financial Times. The Financial Times is aligned with the financial-industrial complex. And so sometimes the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex are aligned. But other times they play games and battles. And so they create wars and operations like October the 7th in order to determine which faction of power is going to win. Now, at the very top, the asset managers that have shares in all of the companies, they get to hedge every eventuality. But the end goal is to extract resources, profit from the forever war model, or where they can reinvest into the rebuild when they can vassalize. And so when you look at the history of Saudi Arabia and you hear the media will portray, based upon the past, that essentially Saudi Arabia is just owned by Zionists and controlled and a puppet of the West. But when you follow the money, you get a different picture. And recognize that the media you're being told benefits from you believing that today. Because if you are Israel, you want the world to understand two things. Firstly, you want anti-Semitism. Why? Because their business model is to get population growth, and you have to join the IDF, and then you join an army that destabilizes the region. Hence, when you have resistance against it from the Iran side, and then from the Saudi side, when you had King Faisal, and so they do assassinations in order to change leadership, go operations. And now, because there is vast sovereign wealth, you're able to resist that once you've got enough of the petrodollars. So this is what I think we're witnessing right now. And so you can have these types of resistance. But what else does Israel want? Not only do they want anti-Semitism to grow their population, recruit the IDF, so that then they can ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, destabilize the region, and fund via US and Qatar groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, because Qatar is an ally of US. Iran's not funding Hamas. Qatar is, for the last decade or so, and they are Western aligned. So you get to see the picture here of how they are weaponizing all these religions. And now, because Saudi has built sovereign wealth and the GCC has aligned, they are no longer working for America. Why? Because America doesn't need the petrodollar anymore, because the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network is in charge. And so if the financial industrial complex is in charge, they're not nationalistic. So they can reset the world order. But also, what happened during the last Trump administration? Fracking. America became energy independent. Now they compete with the Gulf countries to export oil and gas. But what about, where does the money come from, the sovereign wealth that the Gulf countries have accumulated? Well, they're selling to their largest customer. Who's the largest customer of Iran? Who's the largest customer of Qatar? Who's the largest customer of Russia? Who's the largest customer of Saudi Arabia? Who's the largest customer of UAE? China. And so China has now normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so therefore, partnering with the financial industrial complex that owns America and the West. And that's why we're entering into this Israel is no longer needed phase, because Israel was a destabilization campaign. So when the military stopped sending money over to Israel, Israel's economy dies. It gets acquired by the GCC, by the financial industrial complex, and obviously elites within Israel will be included in that as well. But now if it's bought by the GCC just needs to buy influence in Europe and America, invest $1 trillion in all the assets you need so that you can influence American corporate power like Nvidia in order to build your chips and bring them over to you as well. All of this context needs to be built up so you can understand how to translate. And we're going to be going through the MBS and Trump meeting and retranslating it with this proof of weapons network understanding so that you can understand it a bit better. Now, what is the other thing that Israel needs you to believe? They rule the world. So when American Jewish billionaires fund AIPAC, the more powerful they look, the more funding they can get. So if you're perpetuating the narrative, Israel rules the world, when they are simply a function of the military industrial complex, you're perpetuating what Israel needs you to believe. Because any Arab league that is resisting against it or partnering with it in order to decolonize the region and acquire Israel, then you are giving Israel more power because they don't rule the world. Yes, they have factions of power, but they all work for the military when you follow the money. And so they are just a part of the mechanism, useful idiots, as it were, just like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the IDF, for funneling money back up. And what do? They radicalize the evangelical Christians in America so that they say we must worship Israel as part of our religion to bring back the Messiah. And so those were deliberate operations to manipulate religious scriptures and interpretations. So they want you to believe that Israel rules the world. And so Israel will always push out propaganda to make you think they control the GCC. The GCC are puppets. They're just giving Trump money because they're bootlickers and they're under the boot, when actually power dynamics are changing. And the company that came from that partnership was Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco has a board member that's on BlackRock. The Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund in the GCC is the largest investor in BlackRock. So why is BlackRock now doing every deal with the GCC and the financial industrial complex? Why do they install Trump? Because Trump works for the financial industrial complex, and Netanyahu works for the military industrial complex, not Israel. So let's follow the money so that we can understand what comes next and what's happening so that we can interpret this interview. All this to say, when you follow the money, it means we are at the final stages of the forever war in the Middle East. The forever war was a source of profits to prop up the dollar for the military industrial complex. Netanyahu represents that faction of power. And so media is weaponized, remember. Now, the Middle East, the GCC, they want regional stability. That is a partnership where they're buying decolonization, slowly removing the petrodollar, working with China as their source of funding, and buying American power so that they can partner with the financial industrial complex. The finance, they want low insurance premiums. They want steady source of capital. Now they want to negotiate all the deals while it's a military wreck. And so the more the military can make it a wreck, the better the deal the finance guys can get, because they can front run the deals, then take away sanctions, and then have a vision based upon nuclear energy and technology investment that gets a lot of this artificial intelligence energy. And so basically, regional stability represents a partnership with the financial industrial complex. Now, what is everyone saying? Oh, the GCC, they're owned by the banks. They're owned by the banks. Now, Israel is no longer needed under this vision, and Israel is a destabilization proxy. And so strategically weaken Israel, turn it into a vassal state, turn it into a pariah state, and then make sure that Israel catches all the blame. Get Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes. They give the narrative to de-radicalize the Christians and say, well, the only reason we did this was because Israel was blackmailing us. Leak the Epstein emails. Make it manage this strategic divorce so that the military companies don't get sued for the genocide that was propping up the dollar. And every other genocide was to prop up the dollar as well, including everything we've seen in Africa, including everything we've seen in Central and South America, including everything we've seen in Asia, and including everything we've seen across the global South. And so what is really happening here? Well, the key component that's needed for this artificial intelligence is vast amounts of energy. Nuclear energy is needed for this artificial intelligence. And so by allowing the financial industrial complex to partner with the GCC, you can take some of those capital outflows from weakening the dollar, and you can build data centers across the Middle East. That requires, what is required? Saudi to normalize with Iran. And so Iran stopped backing the proxies, and the military industrial complex created all these operations in order to destabilize the region and justify it to the American people by saying the Muslims are invading. So you have open borders, closed borders, destabilization campaign, installation of ICE, privatized prison, privatized destabilization, privatized, violence. And that's what we're witnessing on the American side. So that brings us to what happened this week in geopolitics. Let's go through it. So we had Mohammed bin Salman that was visiting President Trump in the Middle East. And what did they announce this week? So I'm going to go through what they announced, and I'm going to translate the actual interview together. So there was a security agreement signed between Saudi and US that removes the need for Israel, while blaming Israel for everything as the narrative that's needed. Look, don't get me wrong. Israel is committing crimes against humanity. They've radicalized the Jewish faith in order to create these absolute, these crimes against humanity, committed genocide, ethnic cleansing, all that we've seen. But who's the boss? And that's what you need to understand when following the money to get this right. Well, the US has basically now green-lighted AI chips exports into Gulf tech giants. What does that do? Props up the price of Nvidia, and the artificial intelligence company get that $1 trillion valuation for the OpenAI, IPO. Palantir, all of these different types of contracts. But it's a major reversal of the US's policy. The technical industrial complex was previously prohibited from doing this. So Saudi's now getting all of their big data centers built. They get to be strategically important in artificial intelligence. They have different parts of the GCC. UAE's doing the crypto policy, getting those capital outflows via stable coins. And previously, they exported any type of technology to be sold to state-backed artificial intelligence companies. And that included all of the companies in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Now that is reversed. So Trump has allowed that to happen. That was another thing that was announced. This all indicates to me that the financial industrial complex is hedging away from the US and over towards the GCC and BRICS as well. Now, where they can get their higher returns, Nvidia is basically the outsourced data center provider and the chip company that needs to work with China, which needs the rare earth minerals. So you can see this is complete capital outflows. Trump works for the financial industrial complex. The companies in UAE and Saudi Arabia that are going to be the beneficiary of these chips build out these data centers with Nvidia, pump up the stock market, but support the Gulf nations being between China and America, which is why they need regional stability, is G42 and a company called Humane. Here's the quote. They're able to use this to build out regional infrastructure. The Gulf wants to leverage their infrastructure to basically become a global hub for compute. And that's what we're witnessing right now. That's why these deals are being done. So when we say, what does it require to get that $1 trillion? What did MBS say? Well, I'll save that for the interview. But it's been the same position all along. Saudi position has always been, there has to be a Palestinian state in order to normalize with Israel. And so you are doing the bidding of Israel by pushing out this narrative that Israel rules the world. They have never been weaker. The economy doesn't make sense. The numbers don't add up. And they are 100% subsidized by Pentagon budgets that you pay for. And the reason that they subsidize all the healthcare and everything while Americans don't get it is because they're recruiting an army. The IDF is the army to destabilize the region, and we are coming to the end of that era. Artificial intelligence needs this nuclear energy. And Iran was always originally it was about British petroleum. Then it was about nuclear energy, but they give you a multi-decade narrative that's about nuclear bombs, and they're the number one state sponsored of terrorism. What was Iran doing? They were funding the militia groups against the Western militia groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And when Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani, he was known as the guy that was killing more ISIS people, and so this is just one game of strategic tension, and the model's coming to an end, which really radically changes everything. So Trump and the financial industrial complex, they could agree to enrich. And that's what's being negotiated, but it's not being negotiated for America. It's being negotiated for those that control America, the corporate class that pay the lobbies. And so America is a company and a series of companies controlled by a proof of weapons network that doesn't care about the American people, which is why you engaging in the political process is futile. But the military industrial complex and Congress, they could cause problems, right? Because the military is aligned with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is aligned with AIPAC-funded Congress members. They have that evangelical Christian ideology. And so really you got this internal power struggle, and that's being weaponized as a destabilization campaign. And so Saudi, they bought Europe to recognize Palestine as a state in order to hedge against the US strategy. And now, obviously, that's when Jared Kushner set up the fund with $2 billion funded by Saudi Arabia so that Trump profits from this. And because he's going to get massive multi-billion-dollar and even, investments, he wants regional stability because he's aligned with the banks. And so he's not a neocon. And so when you're trying to push out in this negotiation, you push out propaganda, and you try and create as many tensions, and you try and hijack any partnerships. So what types of things did we see? So as I said, the money's coming from China. Saudi is now going to be investing to buy all the technology influence that it needs, which is the US tech. And so they're getting the legislative changes to allow for this to happen. And all those data centers are going to be hosted in the Middle East, which is strategically the most important asset. And so there was an announcement that came out this week after the meeting that the US and Saudi have signed a deal to develop a civil nuclear program. So we all knew that was going to come. people were saying, nah, not going to happen. And because we follow the money, we said that would happen. Then we had an announcement by the White House. Let me read it out. So the White House posted on X, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed a joint declaration on the completion of negotiations on civil nuclear energy cooperation, which builds the legal foundation for a decade-long, multi-billion-dollar nuclear energy partnership with the kingdom, confirms that the United States and American companies will be the kingdom's civil nuclear cooperation partners of choice, and ensures that all cooperation will be conducted in a manner consistent with strong non-proliferation standards. And so Saudi, all this time, has been buying to get to this place. And they had to partner with the financial industrial complex to get there. Now out in the media is a completely different narrative that's pushed. And so that deal is happening. Where's the money coming from there? China. China's buying all the Saudi oil, which is boosting the sovereign wealth fund. This is why multipolarity is much better for the world, but it's not good for the West, because the West was built upon the dollar debt-based Ponzi scheme that requires debt perpetuation globally. And that's what Trump is doing, dismantling all that props up the dollar and pretending it's MAGA while he constructs deals that invest in multipolarity. They also announced that there was going to be a deal to sell F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. Now, the military-industrial complex control media that is aligned with Zionism as a destabilization campaign and Israel, they pushed out that the jets would be inferior to Israel. Now, that may be true or it may not be true, but why would they want you to believe that? Because they are pushing for military power, because the finance is taking over, which requires regional stability. So everybody shares on social media that, yeah, don't worry, Israel still rules the world. They're getting the best jets. Israel is America, the military faction of it. What about what the Financial Times pushed out? So the Financial Times, which is aligned as a counter for the financial industrial complex, what BlackRock wants you to think, it pushed out a piece that the Public Investment Fund exited positions in 9 companies. So it was pushing out that Saudi is selling all their investments in America. Now, it said that it's going to de-invest from Visa and Pinterest and others. But essentially, the main headline was the Financial Times said that Saudi is cutting exposure to US stocks by 18% compared with the second quarter. So that made it look like Saudi is divesting. Now, remember, what does the Financial Times mean? It means that they are pushing what they want investors to do. So they want you to believe that Saudi is divesting, while in fact they're rebalancing into artificial intelligence, robotics, and they want you to sell in order to push, reallocate capital into the Middle East. So when the Financial Times publishes something, it is speaking to the financial industrial complex. It's not journalism. It's a tool for pushing out where they want you to reallocate your money. It's signal to all of the asset managers and the money managers. And then that will be met with data supporting it in BlackRock's Aladdin AI technology that all the money managers are using. And at the same time, what else did we get this week? Well, hidden behind all of that, there was the Epstein email leaks. And this was really just to make sure, because who controls them? Well, they want you to believe that Israel controls them. And there may be factions of power within that, but it's the bankers. It was a blackmail operation by intelligence connected with Jeffrey Epstein, weaponizing weapons trafficking, sex trafficking, humans trafficking. Because how is the CIA and Mossad funded? By drugs trafficking. These are the partners. These are where all the funding comes from. By creating a slush fund so that they can do their covert operations outside of constitutional and congressional approval. And so if the bankers and the donors leak different bits of information, it's essentially saying, don't align with Israel, align with the vision. We're moving to multipolarity. So we, the financial industrial complex, control it. And if the military industrial complex are trying to flex, get back in gear, or we'll start pushing out some of those Epstein files. And we know that because it was the banksters, the Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, they did the multi-million dollar settlements for all of the laundering that they did for these operations. So what did we have this week? We had the Epstein files Transparency Act. It got passed in the House. And this is basically telling everybody, stay in line. Now, it's not going to release any information about the banksters that are involved in this, but it keeps everyone on track to managing this major transition that we're happening of shrinking America into a regional power, strategically weakening the dollar, getting capital outflows into the GCC, BRICS, and making sure that the bankers have maximum negotiation, leveraging military in order to give them more power, weaponizing media, index funds, and money printing of the Federal Reserve through fiscal dominance. Now, I'm actually going to be doing more on Jeffrey Epstein there was an attack on Bitcoin in connection to Jeffrey Epstein. I'm actually going to be going through actually how the Epstein operation is being used for macro and also more of the geopolitical section, including is Trump actually blackmailed. I'm going to do a whole Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 108 on just the Jeffrey Epstein side next week. I wanted to do it this week, but these meetings were so big and we had the market crash. And so I pivoted to make sure you understand the crash so that you don't get fooled for this as well. But anyway, what this really is, or it's not that the Saudi are selling, it's that they are acquiring, asset stripping. Remember how foreign direct investment works? It's reverse IMF. You're buying the assets to have strategic influence in your region. And now Nvidia can build the data centers and you can have laws overthrown and overturned. So after the meeting, what is it that Trump announced? Quote, "Tonight, I am pleased to announce that we are taking our military cooperation to even greater heights by formally designating Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally." That strategically weakens Israel significantly. Then this week, what did we have in the United Nations? Now, remember, the US has stopped any form of peace and recognition of Palestine as a state because Israel is its colony. And so it has always veto voted against it. For the first time in the United Nations, 13 people voted for essentially the US peace plan, which is the 20-point GCC plan negotiated with the financial industrial complex with a sticker on it saying Trump is in charge. And Trump wants to keep some leverage by being the chairman, but Trump is bought by the Gulf countries who paid a lot more in the fund than any AIPAC funding. And he has to manage those different factions of power. And suddenly, out of nowhere, for the first time in history, peace is possible. Because it was always possible. It was never real. All wars are manufactured. It's a racket to prop up the dollar. So anyway, what did they vote for? It was an international security force and transitional administration. What that means is essentially the factions of power will be part of the transitional administration. The GCC will be the investor, which means they own the region. The Levant will be vassalized into GCC leadership. And the factions of power in the financial industrial complex will get what they negotiated in order to end the war and end the forever war. And Netanyahu and genocide and starvation were used as weapons in order to negotiate maximum leverage. That's what backs the dollar. And that's what they don't want you to know. And that's why they don't want you following the money. And they lie about everything. And the intelligence apparatus control the media. And all of this is done via covert funding and criminal networks, which is why you have pedophilia rings, drug trafficking, and all of these weapons trafficking operations backed up by military. It is state sponsored. So don't believe all the shit they need you to believe. So anyway, they're going to put Trump as the chairman. And during this is where it actually becomes important. Palestine needs to, and these different regions and Syria, they're negotiating from obviously complete weakness. They'll have GCC government, which means end of forever war. Israel's no longer needed. And I think Israel will be vassalized into the structure as well. Most people that are radicalized will leave, end up in America or Europe or whatever's going to happen over the years ahead. But Russia and China basically abstained from voting, so it meant that it went through. Why did they abstain? Because it was the US plan, obviously. Now, Hamas rejected the plan because there needs to be overthrow and destabilization campaign. There was escalations in Gaza, in Lebanon, in violation of the plan, because eventually we're going to see Hamas integrated, Hezbollah integrated into Lebanon, destabilization campaign, overthrow of the cabinet, and a GCC regional sovereign vision in partnership with the financial industrial complex. So I've always said that I'm wrong if the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians actually happens. It's not going to happen, even though there were covert operations to push people out via planes, because as soon as Arab security is in place, which is what got voted into this United Nations, the transition is complete. The Greater Israel Project, which was always the Greater America Project to destabilize the Middle East, ends. And we enter into whatever the factions of power, China, Iran, Russia, Saudi, GCC, Turkey, and the financial industrial complex that controls America, whatever they have negotiated, the end regime will be. So yeah, expecting regime changes within the Palestinian Authority, Israel, and Lebanon, and we'll see how that actually goes. I'm not expecting a war with Iran, which most people are expecting, because it was the end of the clean break memo. And that's because I'm following the money. Now, whether we have another escalation, we'll cover it live. I think it would be a theater like the 12-day war. I covered that on my blog. But also, the consequence of this is that if China and BRICS are backing the GCC going to be, I believe, going to be pushing North Africa into regional stability as well. Now, remember what I covered on the Sudan side? I said that why is this media attention coming now? That is the proof of weapons network trying to get leverage over UAE to get deal that ends the conflict in Sudan, which is a crime against humanity. And it will be done on the proof of weapons network terms. So Trump comes out, who's part of the financial industrial complex. And what was it he announced? He said, MBS would like me to do something about Sudan. Quote, we will start working on Sudan. So you got the media blitz, you got MBS visit, and then you got Trump saying, we're going to be working on Sudan. It wasn't on the radar. And what I would just want to do before we go through the final section where we play Trump's interview, I want to pull the 5-minute whiteboard video that I did a while back on why the media suddenly focused on Sudan so that you can understand the capital flows. And I think it's confirmation that this happened based upon the fact that Trump announced what's happening in Sudan. So let me play this video, which is going to be the second whiteboard. Okay, here's the whiteboard video that summarizes the blog I created on Sudan and followed the money.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating thesis from geopolitical and financial analyst Simon Dixon. We're going to break down his take on the conflict in Sudan and try to understand why it's suddenly all over the news. Okay, so let's just jump right in. You've probably noticed it yourself. Suddenly, Sudan is everywhere in the news. Well, according to Dixon, the timing of this media blitz, it's no accident at all. Now, before we get into any of the geopolitics, we have to stop and acknowledge what's really happening on the ground. This is a severe, tragic humanitarian crisis. And all this attention is vital because it could, hopefully, bring some real pressure for a resolution and get aid to people who are suffering immensely. But, and this is the core of Dixon's analysis, this media campaign is also being used as a tool. It's a deliberate move to gain leverage in a much, much bigger global negotiation that's literally reshaping our world. To really get why, we need to zoom way out. Dixon places this whole Sudan situation inside the context of a massive power shift that's happening right now, with the Middle East right at the center of it. He basically describes what we're seeing as the end of an era, the end of that post-World War II financial system that's been dominated by the US dollar for decades. And a huge sign of this is what he calls a strategic managed divorce between the US and Israel, which signals that some of these long-standing projects in the region are coming to an end. And the fallout from this transition, well, it's huge. It lets the US kind of step back from some of these regional conflicts, while at the same time, it positions the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, as the new major power broker, ready to snap up assets and really manage the region's economic future. So, what you've got here is this global shift that's really being defined by a struggle, a tug of war between two major forces, and they each have a totally different idea of how the world should work. On one side, you've got what Dixon calls the proof of weapons network. Think of it as the established Western model. It thrives on instability to extract resources and keeps countries dependent on the dollar, often through debt. And on the other side, you've got the rising BRICS and GCC alliance, and they're focused on regional stability and controlling hard assets like energy and minerals. And this right here, this is where Dixon's analysis gets really interesting. He argues that the old guard, they're not actually fighting to win anymore. No, they're fighting for a better seat at the bargaining table as they manage their own decline. So how does this all play out? Well, with its influence in the Middle East starting to fade, Dixon suggests this proof of weapons network needs to open up a new front, somewhere they can regain some of that negotiating power. And you guessed it, according to this analysis, Sudan is that new front. This whole coordinated media storm is a preemptive strike, and it's aimed squarely at one of the key players in that rising new bloc, the United Arab Emirates. Now, the conflict itself is incredibly complex. The UAE is backing one side, the RSF, which is a militia that has been responsible for just horrific crimes against humanity. And they're fighting the official government forces, the SAF, who have their own backers like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So the big question is, why now? Why this intense, coordinated effort to just hammer the UAE's reputation on the world stage at this exact moment? And here's the answer, according to Dixon's thesis. It's because the UAE is a cornerstone of this new economic order, the one that's challenging the dollar-based system. So the thinking is, if you can weaken the UAE's reputation, maybe you can weaken the whole rising bloc and claw back some leverage. So that brings us to the media story itself. And according to Dixon, this is a textbook case of how a really complex situation gets deliberately simplified to have the biggest possible geopolitical impact. The story that's being pushed through a lot of channels, well, it's designed to be simple, really powerful, and, hit you right in the emotions. And this just nails it. This is the core message being hammered home. It boils this incredibly multifaceted conflict down to one single evil motive. The UAE is backing a genocide just so it can steal Sudan's gold. But, as Dixon points out, the reality is it's a lot more complicated. I mean, yes, Sudanese gold has been sold in Dubai's markets for years, but it's a really complex trade. And he argues there isn't clear evidence this gold is just flowing right into the UAE state funds. So a long-standing, messy issue is now being sharpened into a simple narrative weapon. So what's the goal of this campaign? Well, Dixon says it's twofold. First, it creates what he calls a blame shift, which gives Western powers a bit of moral high ground. And second, it's a direct attack on a key economic rival that's right at the heart of the de-dollarization movement, that big shift away from using the US dollar for everything. Okay, so why does any of this high-level geopolitical chess in a faraway conflict actually matter to you? What's the bottom line here? According to Dixon's analysis, this is a flashing red light. It's a signal that this global shift away from US financial dominance is picking up speed, and the fight for control over resources and currencies is getting a whole lot hotter. And his final warning, it's a really provocative one. He says that as this old network loses its power to pull profits from other countries, it's not just going to fade away. It will have to find new revenue, and it might just turn its machinery inward on its own people at home. So at the end of the day, what Dixon is really saying is that we are all living through a massive, historic global transition. And the key isn't just to sit back and watch it happen, but to really understand the forces at play so you can be prepared to navigate the huge changes that are coming.
Okay, so that was from the blog that I gave on Sudan. So my hope is that this will be coming to an end at some stage. It is absolutely horrific what's happening. But I just want you to understand the sheer brutality of this network, because the reality is that the next weapon that's being used is the technical industrial complex. And so that's why I always focus on those flows of understanding what stable coins are going to be used for, what central bank digital currencies are going to be used for, what Palantir is going to be used for what XAI is going to be used for. And so following, you saw all of these investment meetings and investment summits. But I believe that a multipolar world is going to be significantly better than what we're used to under this British and American empire of global dominance as well. So anyway, the translation of this is when Trump comes out and says, I'd like to work on Sudan, and MBS has asked me to do that. The translation that I give, and I posted this on X, is the financial industrial complex would like me to get a better deal for BlackRock on their terms, is what I put, rather than on UAE terms. BlackRock, this is the really interesting thing. If you look at my post on X where I posted that, I actually had BlackRock come and post underneath my X post. And so there was an account called BlackRock Facts, and they have put me on the radar as a conspiracy theorist and said that you should go to their website in order to get the truth. And so you decide, is what I'm sharing the truth? Is it conspiracy theories? Or is what they're sharing on their website the truth? And they're a good actor that's not profiting from any of these things. I'll leave you to decide. One thing I also wanted to point out as well is one of the accounts where I get a lot of my Middle Eastern geopolitical analysis from as well, Evan. His X account was taken out shortly after. So if my X account ever gets taken out, understand that I'm doing everything I can. And so I back up on YouTube. So please subscribe, hit the bell symbol, hit all. I think the information I'm sharing is in line with where they want directionally this to go. So I've noticed I've been getting more subscribers and traffic than when we were in the midst of the Israeli narrative where I was massively shadow banned and suppressed. But just in case YouTube powers that be decide I'm not allowed to stream anymore, please follow me on Rumble. That's the backup. We stream onto Rumble. And on X, I stream onto X. And also we'll continue to upload to my podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcast. But also join my newsletter on simondixon.com, where I give you free access to lots and lots of resources with no agenda. But in case everything goes down, we'll be doing live webinars and streams. We built an infrastructure from within the website as well. So make sure you're a free member. And by becoming a member, I'll send you a copy of my newsletter each and every week so that you don't miss anything in case the algorithms no longer push my content and get returned to shadow banning again. Right. So in order to wrap up, there was one more thing I was going to do that wraps this all up. We were going to have a little bit of fun. In case you didn't watch the MBS and Trump White House, I'm going to be playing the questions that came through, retranslating it into Follow the Money Proof of Weapons Network, so that you can figure out how to protect yourself. And as I said, you need to understand where these trends are going, that the media is complete shenanigans. There is no, from my perspective, political solution to this. It's all about you directing your money in line with boycotting and disempowering, boycotting the Federal Reserve, own Bitcoin, making sure you don't own it via BlackRock in an ETF, own it in self-custody, making sure that you're not borrowing against it by mining fiat currency, which empowers the banks, and instead you're spending less than you earn and saving the difference. When you have fiat currency, understand the price corrections allows you to get more Bitcoin cheaper, own more Bitcoin every month than the previous month. Obviously, you can do this with gold as well if you prefer, and you can self-custody. And then you can direct the flow of your capital into investing in decentralized projects, boycotting more and more of these global institutions. There's no perfection. I still have to use AI. I can't boycott AI and still be productive. All you can do is make better decisions, more conscious decisions, and you know, commit to being better rather than worse. Is the idea there? And so, right, let's and also, yeah, make sure you're purchasing locally, because that's the thing they really do listen to. When you impact profits and the share price, that's the real vote. It's not the political vote. The political class in the West are fully captured. There's no democracy. It's full corporate control. And all the politicians are there is to deceive you and distract you into a left and right divide, while the algorithms perpetuate narratives that make you more angry, religious tensions, racial tensions, left and right, Democrat, Republican tensions, all designed to distract you and use the politicians as a battering ram so that you don't look at real power and understand real power. Always distract you in those games. And you decide, are you a useful idiot for their agenda? Or are you going to actually fight back with peace, love, unity, which has always been the message? So we're going to go into the interview right now, and that's going to wrap up. And we're going to retranslate the MBS and Trump meeting. And then we'll end Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 107 and give some closing remarks.
I'm very proud of the job he's done. What he's done is incredible in terms of human rights and everything else. And he's the crown prince, the future king. And I just want to pay my greatest respect to your father, King, who is an amazing man. I met him early on. He greeted me at the airport at an age that was pretty high up there. And it was about 117 degrees. And he was standing on the red carpet as I came out of the plane. And he's amazing. And when I met his brilliant son, it was at the Oval Office. Shortly thereafter, you came in representing the country. And I called the father. I said, this guy is fantastic. And I don't know if that helped you or hurt you, but obviously it couldn't have hurt you much, because here you are, right? So we had a great meeting, and the office has changed quite a bit, and we inherited a mess. You actually told me you thought the country was in big trouble. I'm not going to use the exact word that you use. I refuse to say that you thought our country was dead a year and a half, 2 years ago, but our country was in trouble, and now we have the hottest country in the world. You said that also. And we do. We have the United States is right now the hottest country in the world. And between the tariffs and the election, November 5th election, we've done things that nobody can believe. $21 trillion will be the amount invested in the United States or committed to invest in 1 year. So I'm here 9 months, we're up to almost $18 trillion. Biden, as an example, the Biden administration, if you call it that, it's not to me, it was the Biden lack of administration. They were less than 1 trillion for 4 years. We're going to be 21 trillion for 1 year. I think that's hard to believe. The biggest in history was a certain country, 3 trillion. We're going to be 21 trillion. On top of that, prices are coming down. We inherited a mess with high prices, the worst inflation in the history of our country. We had inflation that was a single full 4 years, the worst inflation in the history of the United States. The gas prices through the roof, and that's after destroying our petroleum reserve, which was meant for wars and big emergencies, not to try and win an election. They opened up the reserve so that people get $3 less in gasoline, and it didn't work. They got about 3 cents less, because as big as those reserves are, they're peanuts when you're talking about that kind of traffic. And
so let me just go through a few of those concepts. So firstly, when he says the great, firstly, don't think I'm doing Trump derangement syndrome. I did the same when Biden's in charge. I have Biden derangement syndrome. I have Clinton derangement syndrome. I have everyone derangement syndrome, because I'm just analyzing the truth and retranslating it. This is systemic. It's a uni-party. It doesn't matter who's in charge. You get a different flavor of the same agenda, as explained continually. So when Trump says we got the hottest economy ever, that means we got the hottest stock market ever, which means screw the American people unless you own stocks. The economy is getting worse and worse in the K-shaped economy, but I'm pushing all of the money into the stock market, which is helping the corporate class, and then they can borrow more against their stock to extract more value, and then we can move to QE and cheap interest rates in order to subsidize the debt and support the corporate class. Trump doesn't have a choice in that matter. That's what he has to do. It's systemic because the government is controlled by the banksters, essentially. The other thing is when he talks about $20 trillion of investment, if it is local investment from Apple and various other companies, then yeah, there may be some benefit to that in building factories. But where is all the unemployment happening? It's happening in robotics and warehousing. So this is ushering in robotics and artificial intelligence, which is why you got the 600,000 Chinese visas and the H-1B visas, because companies want to get the talent that they want wherever it comes, but they don't want expensive. They want it as cheap as possible. So they want H-1B visas. So even though it's politically unpopular, it is the companies that decide. Now, what is a company's, if they could, what would a company really want? They only tolerate staff because they have to, if we're honest, when companies, because they'd rather have no staff, which is artificial intelligence. That's what every company wants when you understand this, because that's maximum profit, maximum return to shareholders. But obviously they have to have staff. But if they could, artificial intelligence would take over and everything. So that's all the redirection of money into Stargate, AI, robotics, infrastructure. That requires, how do you handle the inflationary impact of this? There's only two ways: AI, which creates more unemployment, which is deflationary, and the other is getting energy prices down. So MBS would not work with Biden. He worked with Trump when Biden wanted to, because if you remember, when the Houthis targeted Saudi Arabia and pushed the price of oil up, Biden wouldn't help in that operation. And so MBS actually decided that he'd only work with Trump on, these types of things. And so all of that to say, what is it when he says $20 trillion of investment? Foreign direct investment. He is asset stripping US of all the key assets over to the countries that acquire. And the countries that acquire foreign direct investment, they scoop out the returns. They get the returns. It's like an extraction of the returns. They get the assets, and the assets gives them influence. And so that's why it was followed up with all those different announcements of Nvidia being able to build data centers, even though the companies were state sponsored. So that's what retranslating all of that in proof of weapons network, follow the money language.
We're rebuilding the reserves. We're doing all of this, and we've done a job. We're also bringing down prices very substantially, and we've already brought them down very, very substantially. Gasoline is way down. I think you'll be seeing $2 gasoline, but we're now at $2.50, $2.45. Some are lower than that. It was $4.50, $5, $6, $3.50, $3.75, under by all different numbers, but way high. And we have energy way down. But the biggest thing to me, because I know what it means in jobs, is the fact that we're at over $17 trillion, Scott, and we expect to be around $20, $21 trillion in 1 year. And that's many times bigger than in history. The highest number was $3 trillion. And we're going to be at 21 trillion. That means new plants, new AI, new auto plants. We have auto plants coming in from Canada, from Mexico, from Germany, from Japan. Toyota just agreed to invest $10 billion on new auto plants, all American workers. We've never been in a position like this. You can go back to the beginning. Our country has never been in a position like this. And it really is because of the fact that we use tariffs to bring all this money in. And you're going to see the results in a year when these plants start to open up. We have more plants under construction now than at any time in the history of our country. And these.
I just want to be clear on the tariffs, covered it many times, but because US exports debt as their primary export for the financial industrial complex, they always have a twin deficit of a trade imbalance, a trade deficit, and a fiscal deficit. They spend more than they bring in, and they import more than they export. And so when we're talking about tariffs, yes, 350 billion has come in, but it's mainly paid by the importer. And the importer, because US is a net importer, is US business. And that's why we're seeing lots of bankruptcies and M&A into the larger companies. The larger companies are negotiating using their global structure to not have to pay the tariff. So that's consolidation of power. And even though he said he's going to be paying $2,000 per Americans, that's a market stimulus. It may not get past Congress anyway. But the tariffs are not paying for this because the debt's going up. The debt ceiling's gone up to 5 trillion. The big beautiful bill was 1.3 trillion, and they're set for a $2 trillion trade deficit and fiscal deficit rather. And so, don't be fooled. Debt is going up. It's fiscal dominance, which is the K-shaped economy. If you don't own assets, you get wrecked. But they're trying to devalue the debt, monetize the debt. That creates inflation, and you can only offset inflation through AI, which creates unemployment and robotics, or decreasing in oil prices. Who controls oil prices? That's a cartel, OPEC. And who else controls it? China, because China bought massive reserves. Now, the reserves of America, they've been selling more, which means they compete with the GCC, but their reserves are going down under Trump, and it went down under Biden as well. And so what is happening here is MBS and OPEC and Russia and China control the price of oil, while the strategic reserves in America are going down as part of the campaign, despite exports going up, which is why we're in a different geopolitical scenario right now, because historically, the petrodollar was America needing the Gulf rather than competing with the Gulf. And now, because China has risen, all of the money that's being invested is coming from the Chinese economy, which is exporting globally and building up countries through the Belt and Road Initiative rather than destroying them through covert operations. So the military-industrial complex is losing lots of its power globally, and so therefore needs to make up for lost profits in Europe and regional wars like Venezuela and stuff like that.
The big plants. These are the biggest plants anywhere in the world. And I want to thank you because you've agreed to invest $600 billion into the United States. And because he's my friend, he might make it $1 trillion, but I'm going to have to work on him. But it's 600. We can count on 600 billion, but that number could go up a little bit higher. Yes, I don't know. We'll see. But we appreciate it very much. So Saudi is going to be investing at least $600 billion. And that means investments in plants, in companies, money on Wall Street. And what it really means for everybody that really counts is jobs, a lot of jobs. We have a lot of jobs. So I just want to thank you. We've been really good friends for a long period of time. We've always been on the same side of every issue. I think we've done a great job in wiping out the nuclear capacity of Iran. Nobody else could have done that. No other president would have done it. And we had the pilots in the Oval Office right here. We were celebrating a very successful attack. So I had them in with that beautiful B-2 bomber that's over there. And they said, sir, for 22 years, we practiced this attack. Our predecessors, these were very young guys, so 22 years, they said our predecessors and us practiced the attack on Iran. But no president ever gave us the go-ahead. 3 times a year, they went out and they practiced the attack. Nobody let us do it until you came along, and I let them do it because it was the right thing to do. You can't have a nuclear Iran. And so we put you in a very good position. But I just want to say it's an honor to be your friend.
Okay, just on the Iran side, go to my blog, simondixon.com, look up the play-by-play of the 12-day war between Iran, Israel, and US. And I was calling it live at the time. There's a complete theater. You can get a 5-minute whiteboard video if you want to understand a bit more about that, or an AI summary, or you can watch a whole hour and a half. And I go through even how it connects to the early operations with JFK to steal the nuclear program in Israel and all of that stuff. So if you want to catch up on that side of history, you can check out that blog on the play-by-play of the 12-day theater, I called it. And remember the background. China has normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, historically enemies, still enemies, but normalized because they both rely on the Chinese economy. And so you had this reset of the world order via the 12-day war that led to the operations in Qatar, where Iran hit Qatar, and then Israel hit Qatar. And then we entered into this new phase that I've been covering throughout Bitcoin Hard Talk as well. But of course, the nuclear program, was damaged. But I believe that eventually, because Iran allowed certain members of the IRGC to be taken out by Israel as part of this agreement, and they got to damage certain factions of Mossad and in Israel, and then America got to come in and take out part of the program. All three of them were able to give their narrative, and that was all agreed, I believe, by Russia, China, the Proof of Weapons Network, the GCC, and the various factions of power. So MBS is kind of sitting there just saying, okay, you say what you need to say, but that's what I think is going on when you follow the money.
It's an honor that you're here, and if you'd like to say a few words, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. This relation for about 9 decades, and we've been working together for a long time. But today it's a very important time in our history, because there's also a lot of things that we're working in the future. We believe in the future of America. We believe what you're doing, Mr. President, is really creating a lot of good things and good foundations to create more economic growth, more business in America, and also your work for the world peace. I believe, Mr. President, today and tomorrow we're going to announce that we are going to increase that $600 billion to almost $1 trillion for investment, and real opportunity by details in many areas. And the agreement that we are signing today in many areas, in technology, AI, and materials, magnet, etc., that will create a lot of investment opportunities.
So you are doing that now. You're saying to me now that the 600 billion will be 1 trillion.
Definitely, because what we are signing to facilitate that.
I like that word. No, that's great. I appreciate that. That's great. We're doing numbers that nobody's ever done, and they're all finished.
So remember, that's $1 trillion of foreign direct investment that led to all the follow-up announcements of much of the data being able to be hosted in the Middle East. And remember the big global trend. The big global trend is the AI race, the surveillance state, the global trend. Whoever controls the data is going to be the power broker. And so the money's coming from China. The technology is coming from America. It's going to be built in the Middle East. The energy is going to be various other factions of energy, nuclear, all the different types of energy. But we are all going into this global AI and robotics that we all need to prepare for. So part of what I've been saying is you need to be ready for a world of Bitcoin, AI, central bank digital currencies, and stable coins, and integration with all these different things. So it's why I want many people to have as much self-custody and fight back with technology and decentralized rails, and as much sovereignty for you as an individual, as well as your countries and your companies as well. Because that's a global trend. We're collectively moving into that world. And that potentially disrupts governments and all sorts of stuff. So we enter in, I think we're going to have 200 years of innovation in the next 5 years that we're all going to have to navigate. And I'll keep giving Bitcoin Hard Talk episodes as we navigate it together.
If you didn't see potential in the U.S., you would be doing it.
Definitely.
You don't want to lose money.
As you said, Mr. President, it's the most hottest country in the planet. But what you're creating is not about opportunity today. It's about also long-term opportunity in America that will affect American economy positively in the next coming decades. Preparing the right foundation of emerging technologies, that's a game changer for America in a good way, and we want to be part of it.
Yeah, we're doing really well. And this, you don't see what we're doing so much because we have, although the construction industry sees it. If you look at Caterpillar, who's been incredible, the tractors, everything else, the numbers that we're doing in construction are unbelievable. Some of the plants that we're building, AI, and they're building their own electric with the plant. I gave them the right to build their own electric with the plant because no country.
Just a quick note, is a bit of a dig saying Caterpillar, because obviously Caterpillar is one of the companies that many of the pro-Palestinian people have been boycotting, because Caterpillar was used in order to bulldoze down Palestinians' homes. And so it kind of just gives you the distasteful element of the reality of the genocide and the operation that backed the dollar that led to the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians that now they've resisted against because China came in and normalized, changed the world order. And now we're going to need the recognition of a Palestinian state in order to have regional stability, which is why the military are exiting and the financial industrial complex are coming in. It kind of just helps you understand. But Caterpillar was one of those companies that many that were standing up for Palestinian rights were boycotting. And Trump takes this opportunity to talk about that company.
Frankly, we'll have this. China's working very hard to produce enough electric, but we're beating China substantially at AI, which is a big thing. And we had a great meeting 2 weeks ago with President Xi. But on AI, we're doing well. And I have a man, David. Romel.
Yes, sir.
David, could you say a few words about what you're seeing on the job front and all of the some of the assets, and also how we've been helped by the Saudis in terms of the kind of investment they've made, please?
Yeah, most certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. I am a facility leader for GE Vernova. And if you look at the landscape for GE Vernova investment, over $750 million in the U.S. focused on true manufacturing jobs here stateside. We're looking at tripling the output of our Greenville, South Carolina facility, where we make the gas turbines that are supporting U.S. needs as well as the Saudi Arabia needs.
Right.
So real jobs, $300 million in gas investment, resulting in over 500 pieces of new equipment being installed in the Greenville, South Carolina facility. That translates into roughly 1,800 jobs across the board for GE Vernova as we try to scale capacity to be able to meet this demand. Along with that, we're partnering with local communities to build the skill set that's required to meet these capacity needs. So that talent pipeline is incredibly important. So it's real jobs in the manufacturing space.
Well, you've been great, and thank you very much. And we love that state. I won that state by record numbers. I won a lot of states by record. Texas, a lot of them by Indiana. We're working with Indiana or something right now. We won that. We won a lot of them by records, but that was one of them. I want to thank you very much. Say hello to everybody. Great job. You're doing a great job. Thank you. So just in wrapping up, we'll take a couple of questions, but I want to just tell you what an honor it is to be your friend. And I very much appreciate the investment of now $1 trillion. Okay. And so I'm glad you got that out. I didn't want to be the one to tell them, but that's great news.
You keep increasing, Mr. President.
I know.
Each time the opportunities are just increasing more and more.
Well, the opportunities. We're doing better. If even if you look back 6 months ago, I mean, all of a sudden you feel even better. So, and I think we're only going to go in one way. Does anybody have any questions?
Mr. President.
Yes, so remember, the more investments happen, the more influence over those companies in order to ensure regional stability in cooperation with the financial industrial complex. But obviously the GCC, they're investing their sovereign wealth rather than financial weapons of mass destruction that are created by the banks and the financial industrial complex.
Mr. President, have you approved the export licenses for advanced chips to Saudi Arabia? The export licenses?
We are working on that. We're negotiating that right now. Marco, do you want to talk about that, or Scott?
Okay, well, I mean, that's part of what we may have announcements on that later today, but that's what we've been working on is the mechanics by which something like that can be achieved. It's part of the broader process, part of this broader engagement and cooperation between our two countries.
Certain levels of chips.
For the Crown Prince, Your Royal Highness, you're talking about $1 trillion in investment. Could the kingdom continue to do that with oil prices in the mid-60s?
Yeah, we are not creating a fake opportunities to, please America, please President Trump. It's a real opportunities. For example, when you ask about the AI and the chips, Saudi Arabia have a huge demand of unique computing power, and we're going to spend in the short term around $50 billion by consuming those semiconductors for our needs in Saudi Arabia. And with the agreement that we're going to have with Americans, that will allow us to focus that consuming power in the short term by $50 billion from the of America, and long term with hundreds of billion dollars in the long term. So there's a lot of real opportunities that fit to our needs in Saudi Arabia and fit to our business strategy.
Mr. President, is it appropriate, Mr. President, for your family to be doing business in Saudi Arabia while you're president? Is that a conflict of interest? And Your Royal Highness, the U.S. intelligence concluded that you orchestrated the brutal murder of a journalist. 9/11 families are furious that you are here in the
Who are you with?
Why should Americans
Who are
trust
you with?
And the same to you, Mr. President.
No, who are you with?
I'm with ABC News, sir.
You with who?
ABC News, sir.
Fake news. ABC fake news. One of
But
the
the question is
worst. One of the
legitimate,
worst
sir.
in the business. But I'll answer your question.
Thank you.
I have nothing to do with the family business. I have left, and when I've devoted 100% of my energy. What my family does is fine. They do business all over. They've done very little with Saudi Arabia, actually. I'm sure they could do a lot. And anything they've done has been very good. That's what we've done. We've built a tremendous business for a long time. I've been very successful. I decided to leave that success behind and make America very successful. And I've made America more successful by far than it ever was, and that it ever could have been, no matter who was president. There would be nobody bringing in $21 trillion, that I can tell you right now. As far as this gentleman is concerned, he's done a phenomenal job. You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen. But he knew nothing about it, and we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
Just yes, Mr. President, allow me to answer. I feel painful about the families of 9/11 in America, but we have to focus on reality. Reality based on CIA documents and based on a lot of documents that Osama bin Laden used Saudi people at that event for one main purpose: is to destroy this relation, to destroy the American-Saudi relation. That's the purpose of 9/11. So whoever buying that means they are helping Osama bin Laden's purpose of destroying this relation. He knows that strong relation between America and Saudi Arabia is bad for extremism, it's bad for terrorism. And we have to approve him wrong, and to build our relation, to continue developing our relation. It's critical to the safety of the world. It's critical against extremism and terrorism. About the journalists, it's really painful to hear, anyone that been losing his life for, no real purpose or nothing illegal way, and it's been painful for us in Saudi Arabia. We did all the right steps of investigation, etc., in Saudi Arabia, and we've improved our system to be sure that nothing happened like that, and it's painful and it's a huge mistake, and we are doing our best that this doesn't happen again.
Mr. President.
Okay, I just want to go into that slightly. So obviously, remember, the media is a tool for the different factions of power in America. So you have the military-industrial complex that was involved in the 9/11 operation from the videos that we covered earlier. You can see the whiteboard if you haven't been watching all the way through, and then my blog on 9/11 with the Ryan Dawson documentary. Also, the human right violations. So obviously, a kingdom is authoritarian. And when there are factions of power, i.e., remember what I said, the two factions of power in Saudi Arabia, the ones that is aligned with the Wahhabi side that led to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the intelligence side. And so these are the covert operations that happen. Now, MBS is counter to that side, but obviously it's a kingdom. And so when they're talking about 9/11, MBS has genuinely, as a policy, tried to counter some of those. But remember what we said about Safari Club. Safari Club was a covert operation after the assassination of King Faisal. So who is the media? Well, the media, ABC, represents the Israel-aligned faction, which is the military-industrial complex. So if you know that Trump is financial-industrial complex aligned, and you want to negotiate a better deal for a military exit, then you discredit as much as you can. You bring up the human rights violations. You bring up 9/11, and you try and make MBS look as bad as possible. So even if that journalist doesn't know, that journalist works for a greater power structure within the media, which is Operation Mockingbird, where essentially media was taken over by intelligence. Intelligence is a subset of military-industrial complex, which sits under financial-industrial complex. So you have this circular thing, but obviously, that's a strategic, trying to send a blow via media in order to sabotage any deal making or make it look bad or cause civil unrest or have lots of protest. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with any of these actions. I'm just saying, based upon follow the money, these are types of operations that you see that the media weaponizes in order to get in the way of regional stability by pretending like they come from some moral high ground, as if they care about any of these things anyway. They're just weaponizing them.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Crown Prince has been instrumental in helping lifting the sanctions on Syria. Will there be any joint investment between the U.S. and Syria? And will you visit the
Are you from Syria?
No, but
Where are you from?
I'm from Palestine.
Oh, you're making a lot of progress, huh? Well, they like the Palestinians like me. The Palestinians are doing very well, actually. I think we're working very closely with a lot of people that make everybody happy, including Israel.
Yeah, very triggering. Palestinians are doing very well. They're actually still being massacred. So the military side can get a little bit more leverage in this deal that Trump's going to be the chairman of, which is he profits via Jared Kushner's affinity partners, which is how Saudi got Trump on board and why we're actually. And then they said we have to have a Palestinian state. And then we have a Palestinian journalist here, and they're talking about Syria. We covered Syria last week and how the head of Syria was ex-ISIS, but he's actually a GCC puppet. So, regional stability is required in Syria. And so we had a Russian exit, an Iranian exit, a Turkish and GCC-backed overthrow, and Russia took out Assad, which was agreed by all players and the Proof of Weapons Network. So we're going to move once the sanctions are lifted. Trump had a meeting immediately after the White House meeting with Giuliani in order to meet with all JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and BlackRock to probably push forward their deals to front run everybody before they lift sanctions and move to regional stability. But the important part here is that none of this happens because Saudi said we won't normalize with Israel, which is normalizing with America via proxy and military sides to end the forever war unless Palestine has a state. But their conditions will be that it is GCC investment and we get to control the region. And US slowly over time gives us defense deals, technology deals, but you exit from the region and destabilizing and end the post-World War II Bretton Woods era, and we get to rise as a power in partnership with China and BRICS.
Palestinians and everybody. That's very interesting. No, I think that I will tell you, the Crown Prince called me, and he specifically asked me if I would lift the sanctions on Syria because he wants to see Syria make it. As you know, the leader of Syria was just here. We had a great meeting, and he's a strong guy, and I guess you need a strong person to run it. And I think Syria has made tremendous progress. And we did lift the sanctions at the request of the Crown Prince. Also, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, called me specifically. He said, you know, if you don't lift the sanctions, Syria doesn't have a chance. If you do, they have a very good chance. And between the two of them and some others, I lifted the sanctions. And the results so far have been pretty good.
So just to put it, you've got crimes against humanity in Syria, crimes against humanity in Sudan, crimes against humanity in Palestine, all proof of weapons network operations. And then suddenly when the GCC finds itself in this position where the dollar is being strategically weakened, all of a sudden conflicts are end. So that's how you know what backs the dollar. It's backed by death, destruction, war, violence, and then militia groups that come in, and then you have other powers, and you turn all these countries into regional, playgrounds. But when the ability to end them can end as soon as the dollar agrees, and therefore you have to. That's why we're entering into this new era. But of course, they need to tell you it's just because of some crazy religious extremism from jihadi Islamic terrorists or whatever.
I have a question about the F-35s that are being sold to Saudi Arabia. Are these the same ones that are being used by the Israeli military? And if so, how does that allow for the qualitative military edge for Israel? And then I want to ask you, because you brought up the plight of the Palestinians, are you aware of relocation flights to South Africa that are taking place right now?
Which flights?
There are relocation flights that are taking place. Some Palestinians are being charged up to $2,000
I'm not going
a
to
seat.
South Africa for the G20 because I think their policies on the extermination of people are unacceptable. So I'm not going. So I won't refer to anything having to do with South Africa. South Africa has behaved extremely badly. But I will say that.
Just on that, we covered the South Africa quote unquote white genocide one in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. But these are operations in order to bring South Africa, Nigeria, African nations closer to the GCC and BRICS and further away from America as America and Europe become regional powers. And so by pushing out these narratives, it gets their leadership to reset terms, renegotiate, and recognize that, but they need to put some kind of moral high ground narrative on top of it that's acceptable to the American and European people.
When you look at the F-35 and you're asking me, is it the same? I think it's going to be pretty similar. Yeah. This is a great ally, and Israel's a great ally. And I know they'd like you to get planes of reduced caliber. I don't think that makes you too happy. They've been a great ally. Israel's been a great ally. And we're looking at that exactly right now. But as far as I'm concerned, I think they are both at a level where they should get top of the line. Yes, please.
So this is a bit of a military-industrial complex flex. So obviously, regional stability, financial industrial complex. If you allow Israel to remain with slightly superior jets, then it's kind of an indication around that negotiation. You give the jets to F-35 jets to Saudi. And then whether it's true or not, I'm not sure what happens in the end, but this is a negotiation tactic of saying, yeah, we can go back to the forever war if you don't play ball. And then the finance would, kind of say, well, what concessions are we going to get? So, these are different flexes. And obviously Trump needs to appease his evangelical Christians, the Zionists, and the Israel First, because he's actually ushering in what will be very bad for the need for Israel in the future. But actually, in the end, it turns this into a normal state where it's not weaponized, and maybe even a one-state solution. And I think the next GCC puppet in Israel after the destabilization campaign will be to sell off Israeli assets to the GCC, grow Palestine. But obviously, I don't think the land ownership is going to be straightforward, and that will be part of the 21-point plan we covered that on my blog, simondixon.com, with the Gaza endgame, where I was making people aware of kind of the technical Orwellian type of aspects that are happening by the technical industrial complex when they get to profit from rebuild and create these technical surveillance state and police states that are beta tests for what they're going to eventually do when civil unrest happens at home.
As for the Crown Prince, if I could just ask about the direct talks between
It's all right, Steve, 1 second.
Go ahead. Have you reached an agreement on the U.S.-Saudi defense treaty today? And are you going to bring up the Abraham Accords in your discussion?
I already brought him up. What did you say? I think I got a positive response. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, so definitely we believe having a good relation with all of these countries is a good thing, and we want to be part of the Abraham Accord, but we want also to be sure that we secure a clear path of two-state solution. And today we have a healthy discussion with Mr. President that we're going to work on that to be sure that we can prepare the right situation as soon as possible to have that.
I think we're, I don't want to use the word commitment, but we've had a very good talk on the Abraham Accords. We talked about one state, two state. We talked about a lot of things in a short period of time. We'll be discussing it further too. But I think you have a very good feeling toward the Abraham Accords.
Yes, definitely, Mr. President. We want peace for the Israelis. We want peace for the Palestinians. We want them to coexist peacefully in the region, and we will do our best to reach that date.
And the defense agreement, have you reached?
Yeah, so this is a consistent position that Saudi has held on to. We won't normalize with Israel until we have a solution to the Palestinian cause by a two-state solution. And so this is what's hinging. And obviously Trump gets to profit from regional stability. Finance gets to profit from regional stability. And if you can make the region stable, then the whole area, the whole Middle East will benefit. But it would be bad for propping up the dollar by a debt-based Ponzi scheme that requires ethnic cleansing and genocide to continue pumping liquidity into propping up the dollar.
We pretty much have.
Question for the Crown Prince, if I could just finish.
We have reached agreement on that.
I wanted to ask you about the direct talks between the United States and Iran. Have you been fully briefed on that? And are you concerned at all about how this might impact Saudi security interests?
We on Close and I will be working closely together on that issue, and we will do our best to help to reach a deal between the rest of America and Iran. And we believe it's good for Iran's future to have a good deal that would satisfy the region and the world and the rest of America. So we will do our best to see that they happen.
And by the way, Iran doesn't want to make a deal. I can say I think they very badly want to make a deal. I am totally open to it, and we're talking to them, and we start a process. But it would be a nice thing to have a deal with Iran, and we could have done it before the war, but that didn't work out. And something will happen there, I think. But they would very much like, they may say something else, but they would very much like to have a deal.
Yeah, so to me, this kind of indicates the China normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia is the bit that Iran wanted in order to agree to overthrow some of the hardliners in IRGC in the 12-day war and stop supporting some of the factions of the resistance while maintaining narrative, because eventually, I believe this is a bit more speculative, that eventually those sanctions will be lifted. It will be nuclear energy. There's water issues there to be resolved. But I think Iran will be able to prosper the weaker the dollar gets. And then there'll be no need for all these covert operations. And suddenly you'll have, just like with Jelani, you'll have a rebranding. And while Saudi and Iran, they're kind of tied together through regional stability with the financial industrial complex, but also the relationship with China and BRICS. And so this creates a nice, regional order for a multipolar world that I think will be significantly different than under the US empire.
Yeah,
you are planning. You said you are planning to sell the F-35 jets to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Is it part of the security agreement? And how you assess the defense partnership between Saudi Arabia and the United States? And the question for
Well, you said it. I mean, we're going to sell them F-35s. That's the end of the question.
is it part of the security agreement or no?
No, we're going to have a deal. They're going to purchase F-35s. They're buying them from Lockheed, and it's a great plane. We make, by the way, the best military equipment. You saw that during the Iran little skirmish. We make the best planes, the best missiles. We make the best offensive missiles. We make the best military equipment in the world.
Nice. What is the Royal Highness? I'd like to ask about how you see the cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the advanced technological field, especially AI, and how it will support Saudi Arabia to set its goal to achieve the vision of 2050.
But I will try to answer that in short, but definitely there's a lot of interest in many industries between Saudi Arabia and America, and we are signing a lot of agreements in different areas that will really add value to American economy, but also will add value to us in Saudi Arabia. And AI is critical for us because one of long-term problems that we could have is lack of workforce. As you've seen in the past few years, some of them have reached 30% of the global migration to Saudi Arabia. So we know that to assure Saudi Arabia GDP growing with the lack of workforce that we have, we need to use a lot of computing power to replace job in the long term. So that's huge demand in Saudi Arabia, and we want to link it to American private sectors and getting the supply from America. So there's a lot of opportunities in that area.
And we're also involved in AI in Saudi Arabia. So we're working, and we're leading by a lot on AI. Actually, a lot. China would be in second place, but we're leading by a lot. And I have to say this, and our relationship with China has been very good. And as far as buying our farm products, they're pretty much on schedule. Scott, I'd like you to call them, say if they could speed it up. Okay, but they're pretty much on schedule.
Okay, I think everybody gets the point. So I'm going to end it there. You're welcome to... Okay, yeah, you're welcome to watch the rest of the video. But who was it a couple of years back that said AI, rise of China, tariff wars, trade wars? I think we've been pretty good at Bitcoin Hard Talk at getting people prepared for all this stuff. I got a lot of abuse along the way. I get accused of all sorts along the way. But remember, all I'm doing is analyzing by following the money rather than advocating. And people get that confused sometimes. If I were advocating for what I want, I could sit here in a fantasy world and tell you about what I think is just and what I think should happen. But what I think should happen is not what's going to happen. And so I'm all about what do we need to do and understand following the money and helping people analyze in reality rather than the theater and Hollywood movie that we are presented in front of us while severe crimes against humanity are being done in front of us. And the weaponization of children that we're seeing with pedophilia rings, with Jeffrey Epstein, with children's being murdered in war zones. You know, I'm excited about not having a one global hegemon and a multipolar world where it's more about building rather than this military industrial complex that just benefits. And sadly, there'll be regions where they have to make up for lost profit. And that's just the nature of the beast, because the West is fully owned by the financial industrial complex. None of these wars are natural. It's not a natural state of being. They are engineered for profit, and it's all done by lies and deceit. And so my final message to you in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 107 is the same that I leave for everyone. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to do really well. Others are going to do really bad. I want you to be on the right side of that change. I'd rather do it with peace, love, and unity. And the way we do that is by boycotting the Fed, by owning Bitcoin, boycotting BlackRock, by owning it in self-custody, not leveraging and borrowing against it, and boycott the banks. Spend local, support your local community. Think about your community in a world where you are completely controlled by banks and financial institutions and technology. That's what you need to prepare for. So how do you own your own assets and your own sovereignty and be a useful people to others that are not going to be prepared? Well, one thing you could do is we'll break this down into AI summaries and shorter videos or the long video. Please share it with as many people. Please help me with the algorithms. hit the like, hit the bell symbol, hit all, subscribe, follow me on X, give me a follow on the backup Rumble. We got 110,000 subscribers here, but only 1,000 on Rumble, I think. And then we may need that. It's integrated with Bitcoin Lightning and various other things in the future. We're not monetizing. I'm not here to get sponsorship. I'm not here to get put any ads on. I'm not here to monetize. I got no monetization on any of the networks. I'm here to build a community and find people that want to transition in this world of Bitcoin AI, central bank digital currencies, and stable coins that I think we're moving towards. And each week I'll cover this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. And we can assess how well I've done, how badly I've done. I'll admit when I'm wrong, but I think I got people prepared for that most of the world wouldn't have thought that we'd be where we are and understand what's actually happening. So I think that's useful. This was Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 107. The deals behind the market crash. In part 1, we covered JP Morgan, Michael Saylor, and what's happening with the financial weapons of mass destruction that are being built in Wall Street around Bitcoin and how you resist back. In part 2, we covered the Japan carry trade and the crash in the stock market. As a result, what is the long-term capital flow operations that are happening there? And in part 3, we broke down the Saudi and US deal and tried to understand what the implications are geopolitically in the $1 trillion of investment that is set to happen, and also understand some of the covert operations in the war zones around the world, whether that be Sudan, whether that be Gaza, whether that be Syria, and whether that be some of the other places. So I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to be back for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 108, and I'm going to be diving into the accusations around Bitcoin's connection and Jeffrey Epstein, the macro impact of what Jeffrey Epstein is being used in the market side, and also the geopolitical side, and whether Trump is actually blackmailed by Epstein and what it actually means. I'm going to be diving deep into the Epstein side, follow the money, and help people understand what it is about as well. So I'll see you this time next week in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 108. Peace.